Test, test. Test, 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 test. Oh. Test, 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 test.
Guys, if the big camera's nowhere to stay, you get a good shot.
Hey guys, we're live in the newsroom here at Fox 5 DC. I want to give you a little context as to what you're watching right now. This is a live look outside of the state capitol in Denver, Colorado, where teachers, all part of this burgeoning teacher uprising, about 10,000 or so of them in Colorado are out in full force today as part of these teacher walkouts. They're fighting for better pay, for more funding for education. This is all part of the movement called the hashtag Red for Ed movement, meaning they're wearing red for education, for funding, for better pay. And they've been doing this really for weeks. This is continuing on from weeks ago when this grassroots movement began in West Virginia and then Oklahoma and Kentucky, and now leading into both Phoenix, Arizona and Denver, Colorado. You can see really just a lot of people there gathering at the state capitol. That's the gold dome there in Colorado, and more than 10,000 are expected to demonstrate today. And about half of the student population will have shuttered schools as a result, with teachers using personal leave time to take off in protest. So again, this is a grassroots movement, and just many walkouts that are happening across the United States. Again, sort of this is more in the Southwest area. We have a couple of cameras, some aerial footage that we were showing you earlier, and this one here at the state capitol. So they are closing some schools. I know in Arizona, they're closing some schools for a majority of the state's public school students. And a lot of these educators are there to protest and to make their voices heard. Meanwhile, guys, we also have some other stuff going on in Capitol Hill. Scott Pruitt right now is getting grilled by lawmakers on Capitol Hill. We'll show you some of that coming up. And just moments ago, President Trump greeted and made remarks at the special Wounded Warriors Soldier Ride Project event, where he hosted some of the veterans who are ill or wounded, and they were able to speak on their behalf, as well as President Trump making some remarks as part of this bicycle ride that began with President Bush, I believe, President George W. Bush, under him in 2008. It's an annual tradition among United States presidents, and it started in 2008, that encourages wounded veterans to push themselves beyond their comfort zones. We're going to show you that event coming up once we get that video in. So for now, take a look at this live uprising here, this grassroots movement in Colorado.
your future to discuss these and other issues. But I'd like to hear from you on what steps the EPA will be taking to address these critical issues, which of course
The gentleman's time has expired.
If I may, Mr. Chairman?
Just for a short minute.
There is no safe level of lead in our drinking water. It is something we need to act aggressively upon as an agency and as a country. We've estimated it's about $45 billion to replace the lead service lines across the country. And with WIFIA and the authority this Congress has given the EPA, I really believe that we can prioritize funding in the WIFIA program up to $4 billion a year, and over a 10-year process or thereabouts, achieve tremendous.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Continuing along these lines, thank you, Administrator Pruitt. And Mr. Chairman, if we could submit for the record the article from the Roanoke Times from today. Article came out yesterday, but it's in today's electronic clips. Virginia Tech team gets EPA grant to engineer citizen science water quality project. As you will recall, in the previous administration, there was a regional EPA administrator who looked the other way. The Flint, Michigan problem became a problem, but it was exposed by Mark Edwards, a professor at Virginia Tech, because he went out there on his own dime with his own monies and started doing the studies that needed to be done. Now your EPA has granted his group $1.9 million to have folks test their water and send it in so we can find out exactly where the hot spots are, whether they be in Mr. Rush's district of Chicago or elsewhere. And Professor Edwards says he calls this the largest engineering citizen science project in American history. The 3-year grant will support his team, and some other universities are involved. And he said that all the work we did with consumers over the years and the students at Virginia Tech created this bottom-up organic science phenomena. It created a tidal wave of understanding that couldn't be ignored. This is how science is supposed to work to me. Mark Edwards, Virginia Tech. If we could have that article put in the record by unanimous consent.
The Democrats have looked at it. They've approved without objection. It's submitted for the record.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to switch gears, but I couldn't help think Mr. Rush's comments were so timely for that. All right, I'm going to switch now to the final rule for greenhouse gas emissions and fuel efficiency standards for medium and heavy-duty engines and vehicles, Phase 2, that was approved in the prior administration. You all are taking some action in regard to one part of that, which I want to talk about in a minute, but I first want to talk about trailers. And I asked these questions of the prior folks at the EPA, and I don't know how they have authority to regulate trailers when the Clean Air Act clearly says that the term motor vehicle means any self-propelled motor vehicle designed for transporting persons or property on a street or a highway. And a trailer is not self-propelled, nor is it a motor vehicle, nor does it have an engine. It might have a compressor if it's a refrigerator truck. You would agree with me that this needs attention and that we need to make sure that trailers are not being declared by the EPA to be self-propelled motor vehicles, yes or no?
Yes, we are in process.
Thank you. I got to move on to the next one because I got a more complicated one. You're also in the process of looking at situation in that same regulation related to gliders and to big trucks, and I've got a problem because my district has the Volvo North America truck manufacturing site, thousands of jobs, billions of dollars were spent to meet the new requirements. Now, I would agree with you in that the law does not say the EPA can do what they did because they went after gliders and they went after it and just said you basically can't do it, which they don't have authority to do because it's not a new motor vehicle engine, which is defined in the code in similar sections to what I just read on the utility trailers in my district as well. And what's interesting is I do believe that there ought to be something because Volvo and other truck manufacturers spent billions upgrading. And what the code says is that you really don't have any authority over
Guys, a little context here if you're watching. This is the embattled administrator of the EPA, Scott Pruitt. He's testifying here before the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and he's expected to be testifying about the budget, but he is definitely expected to be asked questions from both Democrats and Republicans alike about some of the decisions that he has made in the past few weeks that have landed him solidly in the headlines, including extravagant spending, building a soundproof booth in his office, giving raises to employees, and some other things that have been quite prominent in the headlines for him. So we're going to listen in for some of these questions. Again, this is sort of standardly a testimony about the budget, but he's answering questions, of course, about some of his actions in the recent weeks. So let's listen in. This is all live on Capitol Hill. We'll take you back to some of those teacher protests in a little bit once we see some more movement there, some more action. And then also President Trump's remarks to the wounded warriors this morning. That's coming up soon, too.
Add to the evaluation.
And I just have to say, what's interesting is I think about 80 to 85% of what the previous administration wanted to accomplish could have been accomplished if they hadn't done sloppy legal work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back to time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Pruitt, thank you for being here today, and I apologize for the abrasiveness of some of my colleagues who would rather tarnish your character than really try to delve into the issues facing this great nation. I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing the Obama administration's Waters of the U.S. Rule, otherwise known as WOTUS. And I know Congresswoman Blackburn brought it up earlier, but I want to go in a little more detail. As you know, this flawed regulation sought to expand federal control over 60% of our country's streams, millions of acres of wetlands that were previously non-jurisdictional. It's allowed the EPA and the Army Corps to regulate almost every water from man-made conveyances to large rivers. The rule has created unnecessary confusion and suffering for farmers, ranchers, job creators, and private property owners. And in reality, the regulations have done very little to benefit environmental stewardship. WOTUS is by far the largest issue for agriculture in South Carolina. And I know on your multi-state action tour this past summer, hosted by, I think, Superside there in Anderson, you saw the real negative impact that WOTUS regulations had on farmers and local businesses. These regulations are emblematic of the aggressive and unconstitutional overreach by the federal government under the Obama administration and the habitual undermining of state and local authority regarding environmental matters. It is our responsibility in Congress to use our lawmaking power to enact legislative and permanent fix. Mr. Administrator, I appreciate your attention and efforts to curtail the WOTUS rules. We talked about that the last time you were in front of this committee about the President's executive order. And I just want to ask this question. I saw earlier this month that you issued a memo taking control of decision-making from the EPA's regional administrators on important matters to streams and wetland jurisdictions. Can you elaborate on the intentions of this document and why you issued that memo?
Yeah, there's been many decisions made at the regional level through delegation, as I was talking about earlier, utilizing that definition historically. You know, that 2015 decision, and even prior to that, 1986 and the 2008 guidance. And so we had inconsistency across the country with respect to what jurisdiction we had. And this was an effort to draw that back to make sure that we have uniformity in how we view our responsibility on the Clean Water Act and make sure that every region is implementing that the way that they should.
Why is this important in the waters of the U.S.?
Well, certainty and clarity around the Waters of the United States rule is terribly important because, you know, if you have landowners across this country guessing about whether the EPA or a Corps of Engineers or any other agency of the federal government has jurisdiction over their decision, meaning that they have to seek a permit, then they don't want to find out years later that they should have got that permit and then face fines each day for those number of years. So clarity, certainty around where federal jurisdiction begins and ends really is at the heart of our efforts this year with respect to the Waters of the United States rule.
All right. Is there any effort by the agency to go back and look at these maps that were drawn? Because when I look at the Waters of the U.S. ruling and I look at streams or ditches in my district that were falling under the jurisdiction, these are ditches that only hold water in an inclement rain event, that aren't navigable waterways in anybody's opinion. And if you came out there and looked at some of these areas, you'd go, why in the world is that covered? Is there any attempt by the agency to go back and review these maps and really pull some of those designated areas back in?
Well, that is part of our objective and effort with the rewrite of the Waters of the United States rule. It's not just that there's a rescission repeal in the marketplace. It's also what's coming next. Where's the clarity? Where does jurisdiction begin and end? Because these jurisdictional determinations you're referring to, you're right. They've been so inconsistent, so different in certain parts of the country that ephemeral drainage ditches, dry creek beds, puddles, prairie potholes in North Dakota, considered water in the United States, which I believe, looking at the text of the Clean Water Act, clearly was not within the intent of Congress. So that's something that we're going through that process, providing that clarity, and then those jurisdictional determinations will take effect or maybe change after that.
Just the last question. During my time as a state legislator, we had instances where areas were considered isolated wetlands, and these were areas where loading decks were situated, and they sat there for a while. Water settled, no wetland, no streams, but bulrushes popped up because water settled in there from where the equipment is set. And all of a sudden, this area was designated an isolated wetland and wasn't able to be replanted, able to be developed. Is anything the EPA is doing to look at those isolated wetland issues like that?
Yes, and also prior converted croplands. I mean, there's similar issues around that issue. So absolutely we are.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the young lady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for holding today's hearing and for extending the legislative courtesy for me to participate at your subcommittee, which I'm not a member of. I'm very glad to be here. Administrator Pruitt, public officials and public office have a public trust to live up to. We're called to hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards so that the people that we serve have the confidence that we work for them, not for ourselves, not for special interests, but for them. In front of your title, administrator, is U.S. EPA, an agency that Richard Nixon founded. And I think if a public official loses the trust of people and his or her ability is then becomes crippled because of the trust factor. Now, you have a solid record of breaking ethics rules from the state level right up to the federal government. It's a long list, and it includes wasteful spending. I think it's an embarrassment to our country, and I think it's offensive to constituents. My constituents raise a lot of questions about you and say, how can he be doing this? So the first question that I want to ask you might be a little unusual one. Do you have any remorse for the excessive spending on behalf of yourself, the expensive air tickets, stopping in Paris, the amounts of dollars that you've expended at the agency for an expensive telephone booth? I know you said it's for a skiff, but there is a skiff at the EPA. Do you have any remorse about this?
Let me say to you, Congressman.
Well, you can answer it yes or no. Do you have any remorse?
I echo your comments. I think that what you said is absolutely true about the importance of public trust.
Sir, I have 2 minutes.
I endeavor
to
achieve. I endeavor
yes or no?
to live in a way that respects
Do you have any remorse?
I think there are changes I've made already. The change from first class to coach travel, that's a change I've made. I learned about the pay raises.
You're not going to out-talk me. You're not going to out-talk me. You claimed that Stephen Hart, the lobbyist who owned the condominium where you paid below market rent, never lobbied you. However, we now know this isn't true. Mr. Hart's firm disclosed that he met with you regarding cleanup of the Chesapeake Bay. Did you have any other official meetings with Mr. Hart, yes or no?
The meeting that you referred to was not a meeting with
Did you have any other meetings with him?
It was with respect to an
individual.
individual.
All right, I'm moving on. Did you ever discuss Mr. Hart's clients or EPA business with him outside of official settings?
There was no other meeting with Mr. Hart except the
Did you have any other lobbyists or representatives of industries with business before the EPA provided you with similar personal favors that you haven't previously disclosed?
Congresswoman, as I've indicated, with respect to this situation with Mr. Hart and Mrs. Hart, the only event that took place was a meeting with a nonprofit.
Are there any other
Chesapeake Bay,
instances
and I'm
in
not
which
aware
you
of any other.
granted?
I'm not aware of any
Are there
other
any
instances.
other instances in which you granted access to donors or lobbyists to whom you owed personal favors?
I'm not aware of any instances.
Your travel, including regular upgrades to first class at the taxpayer's expense, has cost over $200,000 since you became administrator. Are you reimbursing the taxpayer for any of that?
We can provide you the analysis that occurred in June
I don't
of
need
last
any
year
analysis.
with
I know what
respect to
airline
what caused the
tickets
change
cost.
to first
I
class,
fly across the country
and I've
every
changed
week.
that recently.
No, so what are you going to? You didn't answer my question. I asked you if you're going to reimburse the taxpayers for the overage, and this includes 10 trips to Oklahoma as well. So are you going to reimburse? Are you going to? What are you going to do
The
about it?
travel office and the security team determine where I sit on a plane, and all trips that I've taken with respect to EPA dollars have been for official trips.
Well, you know what? With all due respect, I may be elected, but I'm not a fool. That's really a lousy answer from someone that has a high position in the federal government. I mean, this is not a Dodge question day. We ask these questions on behalf of our constituents, and I don't really find you forthcoming. So the last a few questions that I'd like to ask with 5 seconds left is when you traveled to your home state, did you attend political fundraisers during any of these
The gentlelady's
visits?
time's expired. The chair
Would you like an
recognizes
answer?
the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Pruitt, I think the opprobrium that you've generated on some of these spending decisions is actually warranted. And I've reviewed your answers, and I find some of them lacking or insufficient. And I believe you've demonstrated.
As we're listening into this grilling of EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, we're going to come back to that in a little bit, but we have a couple other things coming in on the stream that I want to show you. First off, the official vote on the Senate floor here, the confirmation of Mike Pompeo, that's underway. You can see the senators there voting right on the floor. This is an aerial kind of shot of what's going on inside there. We can check in and listen into some of that vote, but more importantly, I want to jump over to Superior, Wisconsin. Check out this shot. We're just getting word about this. This is an explosion that just happened about 30 minutes ago this morning at Husky Refinery. And it's an evolving scene right now, but there are some reports of several injured. In fact, we were hearing that the chief actually has said that there are some fatalities in this situation. You can see that on the upper left corner of your screen. This is a live shot as what I believe is a Facebook Live or something of the sort that they're putting up that we're taking in on our Fox Network stream. So we're bringing this into you. Again, this is Superior, Wisconsin. It's the scene of a refinery explosion that is still continuing to be managed by rescue personnel. There's no ongoing threat, they say. It is contained, but there are going to be more details of the incident put out on Twitter. We're going to be looking up for those updates. Unfortunately, just right now, they have about an hour ago just to report that there was a large incident, and that's all they've said so far. So once we get more of an update, we'll bring that to you again. Superior, Wisconsin, an explosion going on. Let's jump over to the Senate floor and listen into this confirmation of Mike Pompeo for Secretary of State. As you know, we've been listening into some of his testimony, his confirmation hearings this week, and now the vote is up. So here's that.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blunt, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hatch, Heitkamp, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, King, Lankford, Lee, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Tillis, and Toomey. Mr. Warner. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Cardin, Harper, Casey, Duckworth, Feinstein, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Leahy, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Smith, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, and Warren. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mr. Wyden? No. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Thune? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Young? Aye. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Udall? No. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Coons? No.
So as you're watching the official confirmation vote here of Mike Pompeo, CIA director, his confirmation for Secretary of State, that vote to end debate came at 57 to 42. That was the vote. And now his confirmation is expected to clear soon after. So we're kind of watching and waiting for that to be official. And then we're going to take you over to that other event. President Trump delivering some remarks at a Wounded Warrior Soldier Project Soldier Ride event this morning at the White House.
Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Purdue? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? No. Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No.
Place for making of telephone calls.
First, on the GAO matter, we have in fact notified the GAO with respect to those issues, and rightfully so based upon their determination. And I do want to say that the Office of General Counsel at the agency, career individuals interpreted the expenditure as not being within the guidelines of the statute, and that's the reason the agency acted as they did. And those were all individuals, career individuals that were a part of that process.
The GAO disagrees with you. The General Counsel disagrees with you.
That's right. But steps were taken to notify irrespective of that.
I tend to agree with the GAO General Counsel. I want that on the record. Why did we need another SCIF or SCIF-like facility when there was already one at your agency?
It's not a SCIF, and it was not intended to be. As I shared earlier, Congressman, in the earlier question, I simply requested for a secure communication, secure line in my office based upon phone calls that occurred that are confidential in nature. And so based upon that instruction, a process ensued where this investment took place. And that's
Did any of your predecessors suggest that this be needed, Republican or Democratic?
I'm unsure, Congressman.
Well, I think the answer is no. It's either a yes or a no, and I don't demand just a yes or no. You're willing to elaborate, but did any of your predecessors suggest this? And I'm not a person here who requires a yes or no. I'd like you to ask to answer in detail, did any of your predecessors require that?
I'm just not aware of any request of
Well, I have the honor of representing a predecessor of yours, Christine Todd Whitman. She's a constituent of mine. She was the administrator for the second President Bush, and she has indicated that she saw no need for such an enhanced telephone system when she was administrator, and there was secure communications then, and she has indicated that she did not think this was appropriate, and respectfully, I do not think it is appropriate, and I think that there are already secure locations, and I think it was a waste of funds. Regarding a completely different issue, in a March 30th memo, you stated, you signed a directive to give more authority to your office over environmental regulations for project near regional waterways. It is my view that taking this authority may supplant the role of local representatives and experts, water quality boards. You have relied heavily, when you were Attorney General of Oklahoma, on federalism, and perhaps appropriately so, for local and state control over suits against the EPA. Yet it appears to me that your directive supplants local control and that it would give you as administrator final decision-making authority over the protection of streams, ponds, and wetlands under the Clean Water Act. I'd be interested in your views. It impresses me that your views may have changed, Administrator, now that you are the administrator from your position as Attorney General of Oklahoma.
They haven't changed with respect to the collaboration with the states in that regard. I think what you're referring to is a decision to bring that delegation back from the regions. And what we've seen, Congressman, is a great variation, inconsistency from one region to another with respect to the issues that you've described. And so this is an effort at the agency to get uniformity, to get consistency across the regions. Collaboration, consultation will continue, both with the regions and with the states.
Thank you. I end my questioning by saying that I am concerned about what I believe is overspending. I'm particularly concerned about the secure location. It is my judgment that that was not needed, and that is the judgment certainly of at least one of your predecessors, a constituent of mine, Christine Todd Whitman.
And Congressman, I agree with your statement. I believe that that was an amount of money that should not have been spent and was never authorized
Gentleman's
by myself.
time.
So
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the chair and ranking member for allowing me, a member of the committee, but not this subcommittee, to be here today. There's a lot of interest, Secretary Pruitt, in your testimony. And I also have been troubled by certain behaviors. And it has been reported that your decision to abandon the planned fuel efficiency standards was heavily influenced by Samantha, is it Dravis or Dravis, one of the employees you brought with you from Oklahoma, who's now under investigation for receiving a salary from taxpayers despite not coming to work for 3 months. You personally brought Ms. Dravis on the job at EPA when you became administrator, is that correct?
She is not from Oklahoma, and yes, she came in upon the start of our administration. And are you referring to the midterm evaluation? Is the decision recently on the midterm evaluation?
I'm going to continue with my questions, and maybe I get to that. She was hired using the same Safe Drinking Water Act authority that was used to give unapproved raises to other staff that you did bring from Oklahoma. Is that correct?
I'm not aware if she was hired under that Safe Drinking Water Act authority. There is authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act to administratively determine certain individuals. It's legal, authorized, been used by previous administrators, and it could have been used in that instance. I'm just not aware.
How much was Samantha Dravis paid for the 3 months during which she did not report to work?
Well, I'm not aware. There's a pending investigation, as you've indicated, review of that, and I'm not aware that she did or did not appear for work. So that's something that is being reviewed at this point.
Senator Carper has stated, on the basis of information, I believe, from a whistleblower, has stated that he worked with you on a deal to preserve fuel efficiency standards. He has said that you abandoned that deal at the urging of Samantha Dravis. Did Samantha Dravis urge you to abandon the potential deal with Senator Carper?
I'm just not aware. I don't know if you're speaking of the midterm evaluation or another issue. I just don't, I'm not sure
Well,
what you're asking.
regardless of what the source of the, I mean, these are pretty straightforward questions about her and the 3 months that she, are you contesting that she did not work for 3 months?
No, I'm not speaking to that at all. I'm not.
So I don't know what your point is about asking where it came from. I'm asking if she worked for 3 months without any, she did not work for 3 months with pay.
But your question was about fuel efficiency, and I'm not entirely sure what the question was with respect to her influence in that regard. So that's what I was trying to determine, what area you were talking about.
Okay.
I'm not aware of, I'll just say it to you this way, I'm not aware of any decision around fuel efficiency, CAFE or otherwise, who's influenced in that way.
Are you aware that she was paid and did not work for 3 months?
I'm not aware of any. I know it's under review at this point, and those facts will bear out.
I wanted to ask you also, I have a little time left, about your vehicles. At the same time that the EPA has moved to increase fuel costs for American households, you have reportedly asked taxpayers to cover the cost of a luxury SUV for your use. Is it true that as administrator you upgraded from a Chevy Tahoe, which I know your predecessor used, to a Chevy Suburban with leather interior and other luxury features?
As I understand it, the decisions to add a vehicle to the fleet was something that was in process prior, and they asked for input about the vehicle, but I did not give direction to start that process or end that process.
Well, it isn't.
I just asked for consultation.
It isn't the first time in public service that you've upgraded your official vehicle. As Oklahoma Attorney General, you upgraded to a big black SUV when your predecessor used a sedan. Is that correct?
The sedan was something that went out of service, and we had to replace that with an SUV, yes.
You had to replace it with an SUV?
There was a replacement that occurred because of the other one coming out of service.
So it's not just that it had to be replaced. It had to be replaced with a bigger, less fuel efficient, and larger, more expensive car. So it just seems to me that this pattern that we've been hearing today of behavior is very concerning. And I thank you for your answers.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Southwest Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Pruitt, for being here today. And I think that it's been well established today that you have the most famous cone of silence since Agent 86. But that's not where my questioning is going to go today. I have a 30-year career, had a 30-year career as a real estate broker before I came here, and part of being a real estate broker, it was very important to people the energy efficiency of their homes. And when they were looking for a new home, they looked for that Energy Star certified program, things that complied with that. In your testimony, you talk about the Energy Star program and how it helps businesses and consumers save money by reducing their energy use. The Energy Star program provides consumers with accurate information about what products and systems deliver high-quality energy savings. As you know, I'm wondering if you could talk about the process involved with updating the Energy Star standards to include the most innovative and up-to-date technologies such as high-performance HVAC systems, which can outperform current Energy Star approved equipment.
Well, the program to which you refer, Congressman, has been extremely successful from a public-private partnership. And there's actually a rulemaking schedule that will occur in January of next year, as I understand, to establish fees that will support that program. I think that the concern has been just the long-term stability and viability of the program. So we're in the process now of preparing for that, and it's something we're committed to, and I think it's been very successful.
Okay. I think that it's important to both the regulated community and the public that the government speak with one consistent voice. I know from experience, you talk to people, if they call an IRS office, they may call 7 different days and get 8 different answers, and depending on which office they call. What are your plans for ensuring the EPA's policy positions are implemented consistently across government, including the EPA headquarters and the EPA regional offices, in litigation and enforcement. And I would just use the IRS as an example because that's somewhere a lot of people get a lot of different answers. So for the EPA,
It's a very important question because we have 10 regions across the country, and what we've seen from a compliance and assistance perspective, enforcement, permitting, many issues, great inconsistency. And so we're in the process of going through a lean program at the agency, evaluating metrics.
I'm sorry, what program?
It's a management program to ensure that we are committed to metrics.
What do you call it? What was
it? Was
that?
lean. It's lean.
Lean, okay.
Yeah, it's a private sector. But I have a person, a COO, that's dedicated to ensuring that we are setting metrics, objectives at each of the regions, and that there's verticality, uniformity from headquarters to the regions and across the country to ensure on compliance, assistance, permitting, all these various issues that we don't see this dispersion and great variety.
On these EPA proposed rule revisions, which recognize the importance of the states overseeing the implementation of the program, regulating coal combustion residuals, I believe that oversight is critical. Has your agency given more thought to adjusting deadlines imposed under the existing federal rules so that states have time to get their programs developed and approved by the EPA?
There's been consideration of that, yes, and I think you make a great point about the timeline that states need to develop their own programs. We've provided guidance in that regard to the states, but they need time to adopt and implement those programs. And so both are very important, trying to address the impending deadlines, but also work with the states to achieve the startup of their programs.
With Oklahoma being a neighbor to Missouri, I'm sure that you know that electric power providers in Missouri rely on a balanced portfolio of energy inputs, including a large amount of coal for our energy. Is it still your plan to undertake a timely repeal of the carbon regulations for power plants?
If you're referring to the Clean Power Plan of the previous administration, that's in the marketplace today, yes.
Okay, and those regulations were dependent on the last EPA's official finding that carbon endangers the environment.
Qualifications to do the job, and so does Mike Pompeo. That he has both the credentials and the character required to be successful secretary.
All right, guys, we're back over at the Senate floor here, listening in to some of the remarks on the Senate floor as the confirmation of Mike Pompeo is expected.
And we just confirmed it. The point is simply that the man has what it takes for the job. That's why the no votes by our Democratic colleagues rang so hollow. All of their statements have been lacking in any real substantive critique. It's clear that their no vote is primarily a way to lash out at President Trump, because anybody President Trump chooses, they instinctively and reflexively oppose. It was disappointing, but in today's environment, it's not all that surprising. Their obstruction was not only a sad break from the tradition that I mentioned a moment ago, but a sorry continuation of the hyper-partisanship that they've been engaging in with so many of the president's cabinet nominees since he took office. Mike Pompeo, not long ago, was one of the exceptions. 14 Democrats and 1 independent supported his confirmation as CIA director. Yet now, 1 year later, after an unblemished record of service as CIA director, only 3 are voicing their support for him. Nothing has changed about the man, about Mike Pompeo himself, but everything has changed about the way Democrats view their responsibility in this chamber, not just to their constituents, but to the Senate as a whole. What has changed is their disdain for the president himself. It has grown, and they've decided to take it out on his nominees, which is unfair, of course, but it's also unwise. Any frustration they have is all the more reason why they should support a man like Mike Pompeo, who throughout his career has shown his capacity to exercise good judgment. He's no mere lackey or political shill. Anyone would tell you that, and his experiences speak for themselves in that regard. The worst part of this whole debacle is that those who have suffered the most while we get our act together are the American people. They're aware, more so maybe than some of us, of what's happening across the world. Threats posed by Russia, by China, by North Korea, or the unraveling of Syria. So they're right to wonder why in the world would the Senate dawdle and politicize the confirmation of a well-qualified person and leave the rest of the world in doubt as to who's going to be representing us as our diplomat-in-chief. The American people understand how precarious our situation is in North Korea, which Admiral Harris of the U.S. Pacific Command has called the greatest threat we face. This is not a time for partisanship, for hyper-partisanship, or for voting reflexively against everybody the President has proposed as a nominee. The next Secretary of State will play a vital role in the negotiations in North Korea. In fact, as we know now, Mike Pompeo has already taken the initial steps, laying the groundwork and the foundation for what we all hope will be a successful negotiation on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So, those are some of the reasons why I strongly supported Mike Pompeo's nomination to lead the State Department, and I hope our colleagues will somehow find a way to overcome this reflexive opposition to everything the President has proposed and their hyper-partisan response every time the President proposes either a nominee or some policy provision. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Oregon.
That's a quorum call be lifted?
We are not in a quorum call.
Thank you. If I told you that a cabal of wealthy elites and special interests were spinning a web of deceit to lie to the American people and rig the levers of power in their favor, you'd think I was talking about the plot of some movie, some TV show, some novel. But as Senator Whitehouse and several of our colleagues have come to the floor to demonstrate this past week, this isn't about the plot of a movie. This is real life. It's happening here right now. And it's important that we as Americans and that we as members of the Senate face it squarely and understand how this manipulation is being designed to take our We the People Constitution and turn it on its head, turn it into government of, by, and for the powerful rather than of, by, and for the people. Today I'm going to share with you a little information about one piece of this web of deceit, and that's the Heritage Foundation. It's a well-known name here in Washington. After decades of engaging in a mission of formulating and promoting right-wing public policies, people hear Heritage Foundation, they know what it is. It was created, as Jane Meyer writes in her book, Dark Money, to be, and I quote, purposefully political, priding itself on creating, on selling, and injecting conservative ideas into the American mainstream. Well, that's a more complicated way of saying it was created to be an advocate for the fossil fuel industry and to mislead Americans in every possible way in order for them to continue their deeply damaging and polluting ways. Ms. Mayer goes on to describe the organization as a, quote, political weapon disguised as a think tank. And that pretty much sums it up. One of the organization's founders, Paul Weyrich, once said about solidifying power for the biggest corporations and wealthiest Americans, and I quote, "I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down." And thus this intense support to engage in voter suppression. If you are a red-blooded American, you believe in the vision of voter empowerment, not voter suppression. So it says a lot about what this organization is all about. Not we the people, not voter empowerment, but rigging this nation and this process for the powerful and the privileged. The papers, reports, and journals that come from the Heritage Foundation work to muddy the water on established science. I did find it interesting, every now and then, they come up and promote an idea that actually makes some sense. They promoted back in 1989, in a publication entitled Assuring Affordable Health Care for All Americans, a plan to establish a marketplace with tax credits to enable people to be able to help buy policies. This was the foundation for Romney Care in Massachusetts, and it became the foundation then for the Affordable Care Act. In fact, back then, long before the Affordable Care Act came along, people like House Speaker Newt Gingrich, whenever he talked about the possibility of improving government health care, talked about the Heritage Foundation plan for a marketplace. But the moment that administration came along that happened to be a Democratic administration that took that idea seriously, the Heritage Foundation immediately abandoned it, which goes to my point that they are engaged directly in the game of politics on the behalf of the Koch brothers cabal and sabotaging in a partisan political way the blue team at any possible moment. In one brief, Heritage explained away their change of heart, saying, and I quote, "Analysts once supported a limited and qualified insurance mandate, but now believed it was, quote, bad public policy, because the mandate came from the Heritage Foundation." In 2012, Stuart Butler, the Heritage Foundation researcher who authored the original publication calling for an individual mandate, wrote an op-ed saying that he had changed his mind, and he titled it, quote, "Don't blame Heritage for the Obamacare mandate." Well, why not? They put the idea forward. It actually was a key principle of insurance marketplaces. Otherwise, you create an insurance death cycle. So they put the idea forward, they promoted the marketplace, they said this is what's necessary, and then they abandoned it when it's advantageous to a partisan political attack. In fact, the then president, former Senator Jim DeMint, went out in 2013 on a multi-state tour to basically drive up support for stopping the very idea that Heritage had initiated. Certainly have gone out of their way on this effort for voter suppression, which is a complete affront to the most fundamental and basic right of our nation. In reports, they make claims like, and I quote, "There is no credible evidence that voter ID laws have impeded turnout, especially among minorities and Democrats, as their opponents suggest." Well, of course, the exact
So, does everybody know the name of this office? At the count of three. 1, 2, 3. And you know they say this is the most important office anywhere in the world. Is that right? Yes. And you're in the Oval Office? Yes. And your parents are behaving very nicely for a change. I can't believe it. That means they love and respect you, right? Yeah. Let me get over here. We'll take a great picture. Okay. Did you get everybody in? Did you get everybody in?
All right, guys, well, it's Take Your Kid to Work Day, and it's no different at the White House. This is President Trump greeting some of the kids in the Oval Office. Take a look at this live video coming in.
Our White House photographer. This is a good one. Look at this in 40 years or 30 years, right? You're going to look at this for a long time to come. Put some in the middle. Get some beautiful, smaller ones.
Right in the middle. You can.
Good. Turn right here, honey. Turn around. Okay, make it good. Look how nice your parents are behaving. I can't believe it. They're not screaming and they're not going wild. But you love your parents, right? You love everybody love their parents? Okay, let's go, fellas. Take a good one. Take a good one. This is an important picture.
All right, kids, look at right here, please. Big smile. 1, 2, boom out, down low, boom, boom. Thanks. All right, kids, one more time. Right here, big smile. Manny, please.
You love your country? Got it?
Right here. One more, kids. One more. Move back. There it is. 1, 2, 3. All right.
Thank you very much, parents. We appreciate it. Thank you. Good job, man. I can't believe you have that in your system. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Which one? Thank you very much. Zoe. Good father. Thank you very much. Good job.
Everybody get on the grass. Everybody move on to the grass. Cool. Can you guys move back a little bit? Parents, can you move back a little bit? Thank you.
Good. Smile. One more.
Jonathan, smile.
How was it?
Alright guys, we're gonna head back onto the grass, okay? We'll wait for the next activity.
All right, looks like they're getting ready for the White House press briefing. The feed just switched on me really fast. Now they're back outside. These are some cuts, some video clips from earlier this morning when the kids were greeted on the White House lawn. Take a look.
Look at you with that beautiful red hat. Make America great again. Your parents are going to be angry. They're going to be proud of you. So, and what's that over there? Let me say hello. Would you allow their parents to come? We have plenty of room. I mean, we have enough room here to have 30 times. Go ahead, let the parents come. Yeah, let everybody come. One day of peace. Okay,
Stills. Stills only can come to me. Stills only. Here, come over to Stills, stay on the line. Okay, right here,
Sarah? Look at the room we have. Okay, where are your parents? Where are your parents? Come on over. They're back there. Does everybody know? They wouldn't let the parents in. We didn't have enough room. I said, I think we have enough room. Okay, only we ask friendly questions today. We don't want to embarrass your children. So, do this. Let me see. Where are your parents? See, they said they wouldn't let all of the people in. I said, we have plenty of room, so let them in, right? Do we agree? Do you all have children here? Do you all have children? Honestly, the children ask me better questions. I want to know the truth.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
You're having a good time, everybody, huh?
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
So your parents are here someplace. Let them come in. You know, your parents are being very nice right now. I can't believe it. You know why? Because they don't want to embarrass themselves in front of you. You know that? You understand that? They're being so nice. I can't believe it. Who's this at?
That's fine. Mr. President.
Okay, kids. You having a good time? Awesome. These are the most beautiful kids, aren't they? Yeah. Look at these kids. I'm having a good time. What's not to have? This is what it's all about, right? And they're very aggressive children. Okay, take that. Who's this that one?
President.
Okay, that's somebody's. Hey, man. Julia. Julia. Who's this at?
Hand me your notebook.
You know, you're very well behaved. You know what? I bet you're not always well behaved, right? What's your last name? Oh, I know who you are. Good. You have good parents. Here you go. Who's this at? Yeah, I'll get it. We'll get them all.
Here, I'll go to the front for you.
Where are your kids? Huh? Let me see. Hi, sweetheart. Give me 5. Here, give me that.
Sign, Mr. President, you can sign this for my sister Lucy's piece behind you so she can't reach.
Here you go, honey. You have a nice father about 80% of the time, okay? So whose is that?
I already have mine.
You have it, good.
Hand it to the person behind you, Lucy.
Dad. I got it.
Lucy, here you go.
Should we take your children into the Oval Office?
Yes.
Or...
Yeah.
Can we leave your parents out here?
Yeah.
We'll leave the parents out.
Jane. Jay, did you get your sign? You have it?
Why do you want to get both?
I'll get it done. I'm in the next spot.
Why would you want to sell both of them?
Oh.
Give me that. Go ahead. We're getting close, right? We're getting much closer.
Thank you for your sign.
Go, let's go. I love Come here. Great. Doing great. Where's your daughter? Right here, Nevola. He's a great man. No, he's great. You saw what I did this morning. How'd you like that? Pretty good, right? You know they played it on the other networks. You know that. How are you? How you doing, man? I'll bring them in. I'm going to bring them into the room. How's your game? Okay? It's always good. Come here.
Press, you're encroaching. Please take another full step back. Press, take a full step back.
So I'm thinking about bringing them in, but okay, ready? Do you want your parents in the Oval Office or out? Out! I agree. Come on, let's go. We'll go to the Oval Office. They know what they're saying. Did you ask that question?
This is my friend.
He's a great man, and he got treated very, very unfairly. He got treated really unfairly, and he's a hell of a man, too. Okay, let's go inside. We'll go in the Oval Office. Whose this is? Whose is it? Yours? Come on. Sorry, parents.
Mr. President.
Mr. President,
All right, you guys.
You want to come in or do you want to stay out there? Come on, let's go. Come on over here.
Come on, guys.
Slowly.
Go to the right. Go to the right. We're going to the right.
I'm pushing.
To the right. To the right. To the right.
You know that, right? You know that? Yes, I love it. I love it.
Squeeze in.
Okay, let's go over to the desk.
Come on, guys. Let's move towards the desk.
And then there's some room right here. There's less. Okay.
Pretty soon. Are you having a good time? Thank you, honey. I like it all. Come here. Come on, we'll go over here. So, does everybody know the name of this office? At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And you know they say this is the most important office anywhere in the world. Is that right? Yeah. And you're in the Oval Office. Yeah. And your parents are behaving very nicely for a change. I can't believe it. That means they love and respect you, right? Yeah. Let me get over here. We'll take a great picture. Okay. Did you get everybody in? Did you get everybody in? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mr. President. So kids, come around. We have our White House photographer here. So back here, right here. This is a good one. You look at this in 40 years or 30 years, right? You're going to look at You're going to look at this for a long time to come. Put some in the middle. Get some beautiful, smaller ones.
Right in the middle.
Good. Turn right here, honey. Turn around. Okay, make it good. Look how nice your parents are behaving. I can't believe that. They're not screaming and they're not going wild. But you love your parents, right? You love everybody love their parents? Yeah. Okay, let's go, fellas. Take a good one. Take a good one. It's an important picture.
All right, kids, looking right here, please. Big smile. 1, 2, boom out, down low. Boom. Yeah, thanks. All right, kids, one more time. Right here, big smile. Manny, come back. Manny, please.
You love your country? Yeah! Got it?
One more, kids. One more. Let's move back. Here it is. 1, 2, 3. All right.
Thank you very much, parents. We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Beautiful. What do you have? One? Good man. Got a good father. So long, everybody. Take care. Beautiful. Good job.
So obviously a little bit of a repeat event. We had a couple different angles there of the kids in the garden in the back and in the Oval Office. A cool experience for some of these kids at the White House. Take your kid to work day. Also, President Trump this morning was speaking in the East Room of the White House at a very special event. The Soldier Ride. It is a cycling event put on by the Wounded Warrior Project for veterans to push them out of their comfort zone, to push them beyond themselves as wounded veterans. And today, some of those wounded veterans, some who are wounded, some who are ill, some who are inhabilitated in some way, were in the East Room of the White House to celebrate this event, to talk about the Wounded Warrior Project, and President Trump made some remarks there this morning. It was really quite a special event at the White House, and we have some footage of it. And just a quick tidbit here, that segment of the ride is a tradition among U.S. presidents, and it started with President Bush back in 2008. So relatively a new event, but obviously the Wounded Warrior Project has been going on for many years. So we're going to play those remarks from the White House this morning. This was just a few hours ago. Here's President Trump before the kids visited in the midday here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, accompanied by Dan Nevins and Michael Lennington.
I'm thrilled to kick off the Wounded Warrior Project Soldier Ride and to be the presence of, really, to be with you folks is such an honor. I know some of you. We've been dealing together for more than a year. I've watched you get better and stronger, and you're stronger than all of us, so I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you very much. So on stage with me are wounded warriors from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. We salute you, we thank you, and we will forever be grateful for the sacrifices you made for all of us. Really incredible sacrifices. A nation is sustained through the service and sacrifice of patriots. Each of you is part of the long, unbroken chain of courageous Americans who have answered the call in every generation, defending our families, our freedoms, and our great American flag, which we love, right? You are the backbone of our liberty. You are the protectors of our community. And you are the proud, beating heart of our magnificent nation. I want to welcome the many members of Congress who are with us and joined us today to cheer on these incredible, brave warriors and give special recognition to members of my cabinet who are with us. Secretary Zinke, where's Ryan? Ryan, stand up. Sit down. Okay, thank you, Ryan. Secretary DeVos, Betsy, thank you. And Acting Secretary Robert Wilkie, who is doing a great job over at the VA, I can tell you that. Thank you. And a great friend of mine and a woman who I'm getting reports from everybody who's doing well, who's doing, I always ask, who's doing the best? And always right near the top or at the top is Linda McMahon. Thank you, Linda. Great job you're doing. Thank you very much. And Bill, Senator, please stand up. And Congress, Bill, stand up, please. A lot of good congressmen. My friends, there's a brave one. These guys, and they fight for you. They fight for you. You fought for them, they fight for you. That I can tell you, especially this group. Thank you, Bill. Thanks, everybody. We also want to thank our really amazing, these are amazing.
A quick break in here, guys, from the newsroom. We are hearing that the Bill Cosby verdict is about to drop very shortly. The jury deliberated for 10 hours or so yesterday and then resumed this morning. We're hearing that there is a verdict. We actually have a shot up right now of where that verdict will be delivered. So we're going to bounce you right over there once we have that in action. For now, guys, continue on with these remarks from the White House from earlier this morning. But be sure that to know that we will be switching it over right when we see someone come up to the podium to make those remarks.
Especially want to thank Mike Lymington and everyone at the Wounded Warrior Project. Thank you, Mike, and Mike has done an incredible job. Mike spent 35 years leading soldiers as an infantry soldier, reaching the rank of lieutenant general. And I know Mike agrees that there is no more important job than supporting the warriors who have fought and bled to keep us free. So I want to thank you very much. We all want to thank you. That's why we are fighting to reform the VA, and that is why we signed VA accountability legislation into law. I want to thank you folks because they've been trying to get that through for over 30 years. Accountability. We want accountability. They don't treat our vets good. We want them out, and that's what we can do now. We couldn't do it before. That was a tough one to get through, but we got it through. And now we're going for choice, and we're going to get choice, and that's another one that I've wanted right from the beginning, and we'll get that done too. So I'm so happy with accountability. It's been working on so long. We have people that were terrible working there, and they're gone. And before, we couldn't do anything about them. but we're very happy, and we're going to have the finest choice program that you've ever seen. In fact, we turned down one program because we truly didn't think it was good enough. Is that right? We could have gotten it passed, and I said, nope, not good enough. We're going to go for the real deal. So we're going to have choice. There's no more waiting on lines for 12 weeks, and you can't get the doctors, you can't get what you need. So we're going to have choice. It's going to be a really good one, and these folks are going to be responsible for it. So I want to thank you all. This month marks the 4th anniversary of the Phoenix VA scandal, horrible scandal. And we must make sure that this kind of tragedy never, ever happens again. We must always protect those who protect us. The heroes in this room today come from every background and every single walk of life. But they are united by the sacred bonds of duty and loyalty that hold us together as one nation under God. Your devotion, your endurance, and your unbreakable will are all a great inspiration to every single American. Each of you has endured life-changing injuries. Each of you has conquered adversity with resolve, never giving in, never giving up, and never, ever backing down. Have you ever given in, anybody here? I don't think so. Huh? This is not a stage of those that gave in. Is that right? Would you say? Do we have any giver-inners? I don't think so. They don't know what those words mean. They don't know. They are winners. As the nation and all nations watch you ride today, they will see the fighting warrior spirit that thrives in your souls. And by the way, our military, recent budget, General Mattis asking, $700 billion. Never happened before. And next year, we don't even talk about it, already approved, $716 billion. So that's really something. That's what we had to get. That was number one on our list, even though we had to approve a couple of things that we weren't so happy with because of some folks that are not friendly to our military. $700 billion and $716 million and $6 million for opioid. We're going to fight that opioid situation harder than anyone's fought it before. We've already begun. But $6 billion for opioid and stopping that scourge, and also for working with those that have unfortunately met with the opioids in a very bad fashion. So we're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and now we have the money. So thank you all, fellas. That's great. With that, we will be able to see you through that brave example that our nation can defeat any hardship, meet any challenge, beat any setback, and rise from our trials stronger and more determined by far than ever before. Our military will be stronger, more powerful than at any time ever before. Better equipment. We make the greatest equipment in the world. It also means jobs. By the way, far secondarily, jobs. Jobs are a benefit, but that's far secondarily. One warrior with us today is someone I first met years ago. His name is Dan Nevins, and his incredible story embodies the long journey of recovery and triumph that each of you represents so beautifully. Each of you just represent it beyond what anybody can do. It's incredible. Dan served as an infantry squad leader of Task Force Tacoma in Iraq in 2004. While on combat mission, his vehicle was struck by a roadside bomb. Dan was severely injured, ultimately losing both legs. Through countless surgeries, Dan refused to give in. He is a fighter and he is a champion. And the Wounded Warrior Project was there to help Dan along his difficult journey where he's had such tremendous success. Dan is now a nationally recognized motivational speaker and works to serve other veterans and their families. I also know from personal experience that Dan is a great golfer. How do you think that makes me feel? Huh? He really is. He's a really good golfer. All right? So, Dan, I want to thank you for everything. You're really an inspiration, everything you've done and will continue to do for our beloved nation. We love this nation. We're in your debt, and we are in the eternal debt of every single person on this stage. The wounded warriors, these are our most incredible people, our most incredible people. As you set out on your soldier ride, all of America will be cheering you on and watching. And all of America will be celebrating your strength and your tenacity and your unwavering love of your country. My pledge to you, our noble warriors, is that my administration will support you and your loved ones and your amazing families every single day, now and always. Never going to forget. That is our sacred commitment. As Dan comes to the podium, I want to again thank you all for honoring us with your presence today. Thank you all, and thank you all for the help, everybody. It's tremendous help. This group in particular has been of great help. May God bless you. May God bless our wounded warriors. May God bless our military. And may God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All charges against him. Guilty in the sexual assault trial that had been brought by Andrea Constand. A panel of 7 men and 5 women sequestered for the duration of the trial came back to ask questions of the judge this morning. They listened to some of the testimony back, and as our Brian Yennis has just reported from the courtroom in Norristown, Pennsylvania, the jury has reached a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. Brian Yennis, live on scene for us yet again. Brian, what's happening inside the courtroom now?
Well, from what we can understand right now, I mean, it's got to be, we're trying to get information from our in court, from our producer that's inside right now. But that decision has just come out. Right now, what we're about to see is obviously both sides come out of this courtroom. They'll give their statements outside of this Montgomery County Courthouse here in Norristown, Pennsylvania. But again, wow, just a stunning verdict. I think what we were talking about here is this all came down to the issue of consent. For the prosecution, their whole story was, Andrea Constand, do you believe her or do you not? Do you believe that she was sexually assaulted by Bill Cosby at his home in 2004? She said that she never gave him consent. You had the deposition from 2005 in which Bill Cosby said that he was somewhere between permission and rejection, that he never gave a verbal say or never heard her say anything during the course of their sexual act. Remember, both sides agree that there was a sexual relationship. It's whether or not there was consent or not, and obviously this jury found that there was not.
I've just gotten a dispatch, Brian, from Lissa Kaplan, who's our producer inside the courtroom, on details of what's been happening in there. And Brian, once you see Lissa, if she can come talk to us, that'd be great. Lissa writes to us, after approximately 14 hours of jury deliberation, the jury has reached a verdict. Andrea Constand is in the courtroom, sitting in the first row behind the prosecutors. The DA Steele was speaking to her before the judge and jury entered. Andrea Constand's lawyer was in the courtroom as well. And while they were waiting for the jury and the judge to enter, Bill Cosby was sitting quietly at the defense table, looked like his eyes were closed. Again, this is according to the reporting of our longtime producer, Lissa Kaplan. At 1:45 p.m. this afternoon, so 8 minutes ago, the 6 alternates were led into the courtroom A. They sat in the back row of the courtroom, and then they began reading the counts. Count 1, aggravated indecent assault against Bill Cosby, a felony in the second degree. And the decision was that Bill Cosby did engage in penetration, however slight, of the private parts of the complainant, to wit, Andrea Constand, with a part of the defendant's body for any purpose other than good faith medical, hygienic, and law enforcement procedures without the consent of the complainant. That's the legal way of saying he sexually assaulted her. Count 2, aggravated indecent assault. Did engage in the same acts, to wit, Andrea Constan, for the purpose other than good faith medical and otherwise. And in the third count, he is guilty of aggravated indecent assault, a felony in the second degree, did engage exactly as stated in the previous ones, and Bill Cosby has been found guilty on all charges. Joining us now, Alex Little, a former assistant federal prosecutor. Alex, my understanding of this was that each of these carried a maximum of 10 years in prison. They could run consecutively or concurrently, but obviously from a guilty verdict here, if not overturned on appeal, Bill Cosby could spend the rest of his life in prison.
He'll likely go to jail on these charges, absolutely. It's stunning, Shep. I think that what's incredible about this case is how important it is to victims, the rest of the victims who came forward about Bill Cosby, who won't get their day in court because of the statute of limitations that you mentioned. Ms. Conti took that sort of lead for them, and to get a guilty verdict on her behalf, I think certainly has to make those victims quite heartened.
What happens now, by way of procedure inside the courtroom?
So there's going to be a question of whether or not he would go into custody now or not. He likely will not. He's been on bail to this point. They'll set a sentencing date for the sentencing hearing to determine what he will actually be serving in terms of jail time. That will take a period of time. Once he is sentenced, there will be an appellate process, which can be very lengthy, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years.
Now, tell us about sentencing again. How will that process play itself out legally?
So in almost all states, this happens the same way, and I believe Pennsylvania is the same. The judge will kind of request some information to be prepared by both sides, talking about the facts of the case, what Mr. Cosby was found guilty of, and then what his sentence should be. Both sides will get to put forward the recommendations. The state will have its own. There's actually generally guidelines within the state as to what that sentence shall be, and they'll present a hearing likely with witnesses about that.
So there'll be a sort of mini trial in the sentencing phase.
Exactly. And at the sentencing phase, you could see the rest of these victims who have come forward about Bill Cosby testify about their experiences. If I'm the prosecutor, that's absolutely what I would do, because that's relevant for that.
From the courtroom. Okay, so today, the rest of the proceedings today, you say Bill Cosby will likely be held today, or what?
No, he'll likely not be able to. He will likely remain on bail. He's been on bail this whole time.
So he's just been convicted on these 3 counts, and he'll be out on bail.
The state can ask him to be detained, but it completely depends on the judge's discretion at this point.
I want to take a live look outside the courtroom where we're watching as technicians set up for a news conference. So often in these cases, prosecutors, sometimes defense attorneys, but certainly prosecutors on what is clearly a win would come out. And you think about it, 12 days of testimony under our belt, and the man who has forever been known as America's dad, whom so many for a couple of generations grew up with such admiration, who made us all laugh in the early evenings for years and years and years, a man who was almost universally revered. Bill Cosby could spend the rest of his life in prison, could now face up to 30 years when sentenced. And remember, Alex, this was a sexual assault from 14 years ago. Yeah. And prosecutors, to the man or to the woman, will tell you, prosecuting a case that is that old, especially of this nature, is very difficult.
I can't overstate how hard that is, and they must have done an incredible job.
What's your assessment of what the difference was between the previous trial and this one?
It was the 5 women who were able to tell their stories of previous incidents of sexual assault. In a case like this, where the defense is able to say, oh gosh, she's making it up, well, it's a lot harder to argue as a defense that all 5 women are making it up. And so I think this is a great example of the government using the rules of evidence to their advantage, putting on evidence to show this guy's got a pattern. He's done it before and before and before. And so you can believe Ms. Conti because the story she's telling is exactly the story that was told before, and the jury must have believed that.
His role and his persona as a sort of benevolent national treasure, one that he had carefully guarded, his work with Temple University, his charitable endeavors, his leadership in so many different roles, all of that was working against the prosecution, was it not?
It was, but it shows that ultimately the truth comes out.
Alex, it's very good of you to be here. Alex Little, who is a former assistant federal prosecutor himself. We're working to, the proceedings inside the court have to end, and the judge has to release people from that courtroom before people can begin coming out and explaining the stories of the day. It'll be fascinating to know if we're able to hear from these jurors. History would say they might go through a penalty phase before that sort of thing would happen, but you can bet we'll hear from prosecutors this afternoon. Going into this, there are so many legal minds who said this is an extremely tall order for prosecutors. Actually getting a conviction here, what was said to have been, by most of the legal analysts with whom we spoke, a very difficult process ahead. But now it has happened this Thursday afternoon. Bill Cosby, guilty on all counts. It's 2 o'clock on the East Coast, 11 a.m. on the West Coast. I'm Shepard Smith in New York on Fox television stations across the nation and the Fox News Channel on satellite and cable with the stunning news that Bill Cosby has been found guilty of sexual assault, 3 second-degree felonies. He faces the possibility of up to 30 years in prison for his crimes. Joining us now is Jeffrey Kramer, former federal prosecutor, and on the line with us. Jeffrey, your reaction?
Well, certainly a little surprised when prosecutors rack up a case for a second time. As has been indicated, it becomes more difficult because witnesses are already on record with their prior statements. Therefore, the cross-examinations become more robust. However, prosecutors also learned from their mistakes. They have a chance to hear from the jurors in the first time to see what worked and what didn't work so they can refine their presentation. That's clearly what happened here. But it's still, these are difficult cases, whether it's the first time or second time through.
He has always been one who captivated audiences in ways unparalleled in so many ways. That Bill Cosby, the persona, has gone down in this way is notable in this area of women's empowerment.
It certainly is, and we've seen it, be it in federal court or state court, as this was, well-known individuals brought up on criminal charges. However, this one is certainly unique, given his stature going back 20, 30 years, and that's what makes it difficult for prosecutors. However, I have to say that jurors can set that aside, the notoriety or famous of him.
Of course, of course. Jeffrey Kramer, thank you. Stay with us. I want to return our local viewers on Fox television stations and my stations across the nation as our coverage continues on Fox News Channel, on satellite and cable, of the guilty verdict of Bill Cosby. I'm Shepard Smith, Fox News, New York.
This has been the Fox News Special Report.
All right, guys, we're live in the newsroom here at Fox 5 DC. We just took that special report that cut in from New York. Shep Smith of Fox News giving us the breakdown. Now we're going to be waiting on some statements here outside the courthouse in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And let us know your reaction. I'm curious to see what you think. If you've jumped on our stream, see that a lot of you have for this news. Let us know what you think in the live chat. We're going to be talking about this and seeing what both sides have to say. These remarks, of course, all getting set up here outside the courtroom. All 3 counts of sexual assault in a 14-year-old sexual assault, which, as we were just learned, obviously is quite hard to prosecute. But Bill Cosby found guilty on all 3 counts. We're going to listen into these statements. That's coming up next. Stay with us.
I think you know, what any defendant would do. I think you need to close your circle.
You need to spend time with the people that are, forget the case for now. You need to spend your time with the people who are closest to you. And I'm not speaking about your legal team. I'm talking about your family, your children, your wife, Camille. Like, you want to do some of that. You want to start getting your personal affairs in order.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, let me jump in here because you mentioned Camille, his wife, who was there. And people, I think, were a little surprised that she was there during closing arguments.
Well, she wasn't there for a lot of the first trial. And, people made all sorts of accusations about what that could possibly mean. She was there through the closing argument, and it was very brisk, coarse closing argument. A lot was said. It was very difficult to sit through if you love this man. It's difficult to sit and hear if you love him like a wife would, to hear some of that. As I'm sure it was difficult for Ms. Constand to sit there and listen to people say, what they had to say about her. And so all of this will, come full circle at a sentencing, Shawnette. They'll be talking about the Bill Cosby we don't know. Not the America's Dad, not Heathcliff Huxtable, but William Cosby Jr. That's who they'll be speaking on at a sentencing.
I think this is bigger than Bill Cosby too here, Shaka. There definitely is a message here, I think, sent to everyone else, and namely all these celebrities who kind of, disappeared once the Bill Cosby trial came around, but they're still out there. We mentioned he's the first, to have been tried and now found guilty, convicted under this Me Too Time's Up movement. There's a message for them out there.
That's correct. That is correct. And you never want to be in this position, but if you have to be, you certainly don't want to be the first person, because the message begins with you. And I assure you, while no one will say sentence him for all of the other women he did this to, because only one, he was only convicted of I can assure you the sentence will be stiff. I think all of the resources that were poured into this from Montgomery County will be reflected in the sentence. And I think all of the people who have been supporting Ms. Constand, they'll be reflected in the sentence.
All right, Shaka Johnson, thank you for talking with us. Hang on the line if you can. We're going to go back out live to the courthouse to Chris O'Connell. Chris, we do have a shot of the outside of the courthouse and also that hallway. People watching, I'm sure, are wondering if we're going to, A, get a glimpse of Bill Cosby, guilty on all 3 counts of indecent assault. Are we going to hear from Tom Mesereau and also the victims?
Yeah, Shawnette, sorry, we're getting a little jostled here as the media horde now converges on the Montgomery County Courthouse. You're probably seeing a live picture right now where court employees came and put some barriers down to keep a wide space so people can walk out of the Montgomery County Courthouse. Keep in mind, this is still an active courthouse. There are other cases going on. There are offices in here. This has been an absolute circus outside of here. So workers are just trying to keep a little peace, trying to keep orderly progress of the flow of traffic. We can tell you, we heard that Bill Cosby may actually walk out of here. He may post bail by the time he leaves the courthouse and may walk out of here with his attorneys. That is what we're being told. We haven't heard that process. We have not. The Associated Press is reporting that. We do anticipate our Bruce Gordon to come out here. So basically what's happening now is inside the courthouse and inside the courtroom is once that verdict was handed down, they would ask every juror if they affirm that decision. They are then dismissed, and then the sentencing phase and the processing phase begins, and that's what's happening now. The paperwork involved and what's going to happen if he is being granted bail and being able to walk out of here until his sentencing date, and depending on what that sentence is. Again, we have not heard that sentencing date yet. The courtroom is still locked down. If you can hear above me, news helicopters flying above. I see 3 of them. The crowd outside the Montgomery County Courthouse continues to grow with supporters and some jubilation from victims and accusers who have long been telling that Bill Cosby has to atone for what he has done. And no doubt we're going to hear some celebration from those victims and accusers, 6 of them who testified in this trial, including the main victim, Andrea Constant. We understand our Bruce Gordon is on his way outside the courtroom right now, and I'm literally going to hand off the microphone to Bruce as he's coming out of the courthouse. Bruce, we're live. We just briefed everyone, so let's get with Elaine. Sure. Come on over here. So as Bruce Gordon's just coming out of the courtroom, and hey, Elaine. We got Bruce Gordon here.
We're standing by just a little bit continuing on this breaking news. Bill Cosby here guilty on all 3 counts.
As the jury indicated.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Go ahead, Bruce.
An incredible scene inside the courthouse just a couple of minutes ago as the jury indicated guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. The real argument in there was about Mr. Cosby's bail, currently set at $1 million, 10%, meaning he would actually have to forfeit $100,000 were he to fail to show up for future court appearances. The district attorney, Kevin Steele, wanted that bail revoked. Said that Mr. Cosby at this point is now a flight risk, as opposed to someone cloaked in the presumption of innocence. He has now been found guilty on all 3 of these counts and could face some significant prison time. At one point, the judge, who clearly was not buying what Mr. Steele was requesting, said, "What evidence do you have that Mr. Cosby would be a flight risk?" Mr. Steele yelled, "He has a plane." At which point Cosby, who has said virtually nothing throughout this entire trial and has always maintained a kind of a steely exterior, shouted, "He doesn't have a plane, you a-hole." Didn't say A, by the way. Everyone in the audience in the courtroom let out a gasp. After that, Mr. Cosby kind of settled down, quieted down, but he was clearly very agitated about the idea that he would use a private plane, which he claims he does not have, to actually flee the country. The district attorney's office has confirmed they do have his passport. The judge at this point says the bail conditions will remain as they were. Cosby is essentially under house arrest. He's been told he must remain at his home on the 8200 block of New 2nd Street in Elkins Park, Cheltenham Township, and so he is not allowed to leave there as the sentencing process plays itself out. That sentencing process will include what's called a sexually violent predator assessment. That is to say, this is someone who's now been convicted of a sexual crime, and they will have to do an assessment to see exactly what would be the appropriate punishment. We should tell you, as we've told you in the past, that all 3 of these 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault carry a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. So in theory, this could be a maximum of 30 years in prison if the 3 sentences were all run consecutively, that is, one after the other, and all were maximums. The fact is, Mr. Cosby has no prior criminal record, though, as we know, lots and lots of accusers out there, and so the idea that he would wind up doing 30 years would seem virtually impossible. But remember, he was 79 years old at the first trial. He is now 80 years old. He is in relatively poor health. He is legally blind, as we've discussed quite often throughout these couple of trials, and so any kind of a prison sentence of significant years could be tantamount to a life sentence for Bill Cosby. So we are waiting. It could be a little while. He's Chris O'Connell's just asking whether he's walking out. I don't expect him to be walking out for at least a few minutes, as some of this paperwork has to get handled. The jury in this case, 7 men, 5 women, 10 of them white, 2 of them African American. They are going to be put on a bus, sent back to their hotel, and then sent back to their homes. The judge made very clear to them that if they wish to talk to reporters, they may, but they're obviously under no obligation. They're doing everything they can to try and keep their anonymity to the best they can. We are told, by the way, Chris, that the over by the cars is where the Cosby team may speak. If they're going to speak at all, they may do that over there. So we'll try to get that sound as it happens. You may recall that last summer when a mistrial was declared, they came right out the the front door here and spoke there. We were told that if they're going to have anything to say, they'll do it right around the side. As early, or as I guess I should say, as recently as this morning, the Cosby team was projecting an air of confidence that there would be a not guilty verdict, despite what they viewed as unfair tactics by the district attorney. You'll recall during the first trial, Mrs. Cosby lashed out at the judge in this case, Judge Stephen O'Neill, claiming he was biased, that he was unfair. But again, the Cosby team this morning was indicating that they were rather confident. Not you'd expect them to say anything else, obviously, but they were projecting confidence that this would be a not guilty verdict. By the way, we did not see Camille Cosby, Mr. Cosby's wife, in court as the verdict was read. We did see Andrea Constand, of course, the chief accuser in this case, and there were a half dozen or thereabouts other Cosby accusers, women who have been here throughout the entirety of this trial and Cosby's first trial last summer, and those women burst into tears, gasped and burst into tears as that verdict was read, that verdict was announced. In fact, such a display of emotion, they were removed from the courtroom almost immediately. So, the reaction from Mr. Cosby himself was hard to gauge. It did not appear he had any significant reaction. He has sat, as I say, rather stony-faced throughout most of these proceedings when he wasn't dozing off during breaks. But again, that one explosion of temper that we saw when it was suggested he might flee the country using his private plane. He doesn't have a plane, said Cosby in third person, you a-hole. Again, not what you might expect from America's dad, but America's dad at this point has now been found guilty on 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault, guys.
Bruce, we did see a shot that appeared to be Tom Mesereau walking through the hallway. Unclear if he or Bill Cosby are coming out. But go back a little bit when you talked about the bail and that outburst there. What is your thought behind the thinking that he could be a flight risk? I mean, again, we're talking about an 80-year-old man here. What do you make of that back and forth?
It was an interesting argument there, because when you think about it, earlier in this trial, there was a discussion, you may remember, of the $3.4 million settlement in that civil suit that Andrea Constand had filed against Cosby. And at one point, the defense was attempting to suggest that that $3.4 million was, in essence, pocket change. In other words, they're trying to show that, gee, this was just us getting rid of a nuisance by writing a check for $3.4 million, not that big a deal to a man of Mr. Cosby's wealth. Well, Mr. Steele, Kevin Steele, the district attorney here in Montgomery, attempted to turn that logic around and say, look, if the bail here is $1 million, 10% cash, meaning you'd have to come up with $100,000, you'd lose that $100,000 if you didn't show up at one of your hearings. If $3.4 million is pocket change, this is even less than pocket change, and so it wouldn't matter to him at all if he lost that money. He has the wherewithal to go wherever he wants. Now, again, the judge, before rejecting that call for a revocation of bail, did make certain that Cosby's passport had been surrendered, and it had been for quite some time, so he at least theoretically would not be able to leave the country. Could he go elsewhere? Well, theoretically, but again, the judge has indicated to him he does not want him to leave his own home. He is, in essence, on house arrest right now. I have to tell you, the tension in the courtroom as we were awaiting that verdict was really quite remarkable. We had been getting warnings throughout the morning. When we would be called back into court, the message that we got on our warning system would say something along the lines of, we're coming back to court in 20 minutes, the jury has a question. Well, this time, we simply were told court resumes at 1:30. So from 1:30, when we all got back in the courtroom, to 1:45, when the verdict was read, there was all kinds of tea leaf reading and trying to read people's faces. Did they look happy? Did they look upset about this? It was really quite a fascinating thing to behold. Again, Andrea Constand in the courtroom, other Cosby accusers, the jury itself obviously up in the main jury box, but in the back of the courtroom were the 6 alternate jurors who again sat through all of this but did not get to weigh in ultimately. There were no jurors bounced during the deliberations, which lasted, I would say, just over a day when you take out all the additional stuff that goes on. But again, all those 6 alternate jurors were in the courtroom. They were then let out to be reunited with the jurors who actually determined this case, and they're going to be sent back to their hotel and then back to their homes.
Bruce, were you surprised, or was Bill Cosby's reaction what you would have expected considering this conviction here? I think for viewers at home who've been following this through us on social media, you have a seat in the courtroom. They want to know, what did his face look like? What did he say? Did he cry? Was his reaction what you would have expected, having been in the courtroom?
That's the fascinating thing. We may actually, I'm just trying to make sure. Oh, let's turn around here real quickly here. This is Victoria Valentino. one of Cosby's accusers.
8 years.
Victoria.
Yes.
Bruce Gordon, we talked yesterday, and you said that a not guilty verdict in this trial would not dampen the Me Too movement. You've got a guilty verdict now. What do you think?
Well, we have a tsunami, baby.
You're confident this is just the beginning for this movement?
It is. It is.
48 years.
That's Victoria Valentino, one of many accusers facing Bill Cosby, whose case has never gotten to trial and will certainly not get to trial. Her case happening back in the late 60s, in fact, in the early 70s, when she says she was drugged and molested by Bill Cosby. We spoke to her yesterday, and I asked her specifically, look, if there is a not guilty verdict, what does that mean? She said, well, I would certainly be disappointed, but it will not end this movement because this is she described it just now as a tsunami. Yesterday, she called it a snowball rolling downhill. So the momentum is there, she said, no matter what the verdict here, but clearly she's ecstatic by this verdict.
I think you can clearly understand the emotion here, though, Bruce, too, as we talk about those victims, those accusers, victims, breaking down in tears. Actually, can we hear her?
I get over a glass of champagne.
Are you surprised the jury came back so quickly?
Yeah, actually I am. I was steeling myself for a mistrial. And I'm so grateful that I don't have to deal with that.
Did you say anything to her?
No, I haven't, but I've been in touch with her mother. And, mother to mother, our hearts are full.
Did you spoke to her mother just now?
Just before the verdict.
And what did her mother say just before the verdict?
Just hoping and praying, and standing behind us.
Victoria,
yes.
Were you surprised at all by this? Obviously, I know what you wanted to hear. Were you surprised by this at all? Were you surprised by the verdict at all? Obviously, this could have gone either way.
You're right. I expected a mistrial this time, and I was steeling myself for it, but justice at last. When you heard that first guilty, what went through your mind? What was in your heart? I was outside in the park, and I saw the crowds all across the street. I was so shocked and surprised. Lily Bernard, Carolyn.
I'm going to go to them first, and I'll be right back. I'm sorry.
Lily Bernard, one of the other accusers who's been very active in blasting Cosby over the last number of days, weeks, and months, frankly. Talking to reporters on the other side, they're a little tough to get at her to hear what she has to say. We'll see if we can get her over in a minute.
The podium. Everybody's at the podium.
There is a podium that's been set up on the sort of the side plaza here at the courthouse.
Hey, Bruce, Victoria.
That gives folks a chance here. Lily, can we ask you your reaction?
Sorry,
your reaction, Lily.
How do you feel?
How do I feel? I feel highly. Where's right here. I feel like I'm dreaming. Can you pinch me? I feel like I'm dreaming. I feel like
When you first heard that guilty
Can you hold on? I'm trying to answer a question, please.
I'm sorry.
I feel like my faith in humanity is restored. This is a victory not just for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not just for the victim in the case, Andrea Constant, not just for the 62 of us publicly known survivors of Bill Cosby's drug-facilitated sexual crimes against women, but it's also a victory for all sexual assault survivors, female and male. It's a victory for womanhood. And I thank the jury so much for positioning themselves on the right side of history.
Gloria, out here, come on. Straight down. Come on. I'm trying to get folks to go over to the podium area. That was Lily Bernard. You just heard there, another Cosby accuser, another woman who says that Cosby drugged and molested her years ago. Another of the Cosby accusers who frankly never got their day in court and so have almost lived vicariously, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but have lived vicariously through the Andrea Constant case here. They are heading over to the podium right now where we have another camera set up, and we hope to be able to hear their responses to the questions that will be coming from reporters who want to know their reaction to this. Again, our Chris O'Connell is going to head over there to take part in that news conference. Again, Lily Bernard was among the Cosby accusers who was so overcome with emotion when that verdict was announced that she burst into tears, let out a loud gasp, and in fact it was such a loud gasp and reaction that she was removed along with several others course, from the courtroom, the judge having already warned folks not to show any kind of display of emotion or reaction to this when the verdict came down. So we're going to hear more from them hopefully in just a couple of minutes.
It looks like
but this has been a remarkable afternoon.
It looks like they're setting up for Gloria Allred to speak.
Yeah, Gloria Allred has been a fixture here at this trial. She represents a total of 33 Cosby accusers, and she is actually the attorney representing, for media purposes at least, three of the additional five accusers in this case. I'll stop talking now, and I can't see her, but I'm told she's about ready to speak, so I'll let her do some talking.
This is Gloria Allred at the podium here.
Hi,
Just
okay.
beginning to speak. Let's listen in.
I'm attorney Gloria Allred. I represent 33 accusers of Bill Cosby. And I would like to make a short statement. Then I would like to also make a statement on behalf of the 3 of the 5 prior bad act witnesses whom I represent who testified in this second criminal trial. First of all, I want to thank the jury. Justice has been done! And we're very, very happy and proud of this result. Beginning in late 2014, the accusers of Mr. Cosby, whom I represented, began to speak out. It took a great deal of courage. In the beginning, many were not believed. We are so happy that finally we can say women are believed, and not only on #MeToo, but in a court of law where they were under oath, where they testified truthfully, where they were attacked, where they were smeared, where they were denigrated, where there were attempts to discredit them. And after all is said and done, women were finally believed, and we thank the jury so much for that. And they were believed after the prosecution met their high standard of having to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the jury in this second criminal trial found that they believed women. And I'm the happiest I have been about any court decision in 42 years. Shalon Lasha, who testified at this trial, states about the guilty verdict, "I feel that the judicial system works. 32 years of nightmares and tears are over. Thanks to all of those who have supported me." Lieslot Lublin, my client who testified at this trial as well, she's a teacher in Las Vegas, says, "I am extremely grateful to see that the jury was able to see past his defense attorney's lies." And she says more. If people would, all right. But people keep emailing me, so it's kind of covering up what they're saying. "I truly hope that his long list of victims will now be able to find some kind of peace." And we will have more from her a little bit later. And finally, we also have a statement from Janice Baker Kinney, who also testified at this trial. And, all right, there we go. Her statement is, "I am overwhelmed with joy, relief, and gratitude. Joy that finally justice has been served. Relief that the years of this toxic chain of silence has been broken, and we can now move forward with our heads held high." And there will be more from her later. So I just want to say, it's been a very long journey, but this is an historic result. This was her story. Not his story, not history, but the story of her, the story of Andrea Constant, the story of all of those who took that risk against a rich, powerful, famous man, took the risk of being denigrated publicly, took the risk of being sued for what they said because he had the resources to do it, took the risk of being shamed and blamed as the defense did in their final argument, took those risks, and they took the risks so that their truth could be known, so that their truth could be believed. And yes, the Me Too movement has arrived and is well and is living in Montgomery County, throughout this nation, and throughout this world. Thank you. Oh, lastly, I do want to thank Prosecutor Kevin Steele, Kristen Fedden, Stewart, an amazing prosecutorial office. They believed in this case. They went through that first trial, ended in deadlock. Some prosecutors would not have retried the case. They took that risk for justice, so I want to thank them, Detective Reep, Detective Schaefer, all of those who worked so hard behind the scenes and who also believe my clients, and just everyone. So Tom Mesereau, you tried, you failed, the personal attacks did not work. Bill Cosby, 3 words for you: guilty, guilty, guilty. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm sure that others would like to speak as well. But let's just have some questions first. Okay. All right. Thank you. Who would like to speak?
Definitely Lily.
You want to ask a question first? Or you want them to speak?
Let Victoria go first. Get in there, Vic.
I just want to thank DA Steele and his amazing team and all of the people who believed in us every step of the way. We are so grateful to all of you, and thank you, thank you, thank you. We are vindicated, we are validated, and we are now part of the tsunami of women's power and justice. We are not shutting up, and we're not going away. Get over it.
Thank you.
I stand here in the spirit of Martin Luther King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but today it has bent towards justice. Last year, when I was sitting in the courtroom of the first trial and the verdict was hung, I left with such a tremendous sense of disappointment, and it became evident to me that the justice system is light years behind modern culture. But today, this jury has shown that what the Me Too movement has saying is that women are worthy of being believed. And I thank the jury. I thank the prosecution. But I looked at that jury, there's this one young black man on that jury who I looked upon as my son, and I know the disappointment that he felt in looking at a beloved black male iconic father figure and being able to yet render a guilty verdict. I thank him. I thank all the juries, and this is a victory not just for Andrea Constant, whom I consider to be the Joan of Arc in the war on rape. It is not just a victory for the Commonwealth. It is not just a victory for the 62 of us publicly known Cosby survivors whom Gloria Allred has helped give a voice. It is also a victory for womanhood, and it is a victory for all sexual assault survivors, female and male. And I thank you all in the media. You are the pillars of democracy. Without you, none of this would have happened.
So one last point, which is, I said before the verdict, how many women does it take for one woman to be believed over the denial of one rich, powerful, famous man? And the answer in this case is 4. All right, thank you so much, and we'll see you later.
All right, we just heard from some of Bill Cosby's accusers, and before that, Gloria Allred representing some of those accusers. Allred saying thank you to the jury. She said justice has been done, and she is proud of those results. She mentioned back in 2014, she said when this all started, when she began representing some of these women, they were afraid to speak out. They were not believed, and she says right now on this day, women are believed in a court of law, not just in the hashtag #MeToo movement. Some of those accusers speaking there, no sight of Andrea Constant just yet. Also noted, though, she said decades of nightmares and tears are over for these women. Powerful. Do we have Bruce Gordon here standing by? This is just powerful, Bruce. I mean, it's not just a woman's issue, but I got to tell you, as a woman, I just got chills listening to these women speak. There is a lot of truth in what they said. As in any court process, they were discredited. People didn't believe them. They were attacked and for years did not want to come forward. And today is a celebration for them.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because these women came forward haltingly in some cases, grudgingly in some cases, knowing that this was going to be the ultimate uphill battle to say, this powerful, rich person did something to me that no one should do to another person. And my story is likely to not be believed. There are a million excuses for why this kind of thing could happen. You didn't dress the right way. You didn't act the right way. You went to someone's home and you shouldn't have. All kinds of rationales, all kinds of excuses, and they all came into play for years and years, and this time those rationales, those excuses did not play in this courtroom. Again, a mixture of men and women, a mixture of white folks and black folks, and in the end, they all came together to agree that what the prosecution claimed happened did in fact happen, and they weren't going to allow some of the superfluous stuff, the sideline stuff, to get in the way. You know, one of the many, as we're waiting here right up in front of the courthouse here, we're waiting for Cosby and his team to leave the courthouse, and again, there is some paperwork that goes along with being found guilty, as you might imagine. But while we're waiting, I will tell you that there are some incredible subplots of this, one of which, of course, I'll give you the short version, is that Kevin Steele took a lot of grief for taking this trial to a second trial after the mistrial last summer. Bruce Castor, the district attorney back in 2005, looked at this case, decided it was not a strong enough case to take to trial, and so declined to press charges against Mr. Cosby. That was a controversial decision at the time. It was, of course, the focal point of the district attorney's race between Kevin Steele and Bruce Castor. Ultimately, had this gone to a not guilty verdict or another hung jury, Kevin Steele would have been hammered pretty hard in the court of public opinion. So right now, he's got the guilty verdict that he was hoping for. Obviously, he believes this is justice, but in addition, this is sort of a, yeah, well, you didn't take it to court, Mr. Castor, I did, and I won the case. And so there is a lot of joy. You'll never hear Kevin Steele probably say it. He's not going to rub it in, if you will, with Mr. Castor. But if this thing had gone the other way, you would have heard a lot of I told you so's. Why did you bring this to trial again? Why did you waste taxpayer dollars? But again, the conviction has now been gained. I guess technically it's not a conviction until the sentencing, but he has been found, Mr. Cosby has been found not guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. Just to be clear, 3 different counts, but all involving the same incident, the same fact pattern, the same set of circumstances, 3 different elements of that charge. So there was always the assumption by those of us watching this case that 1 not guilty would likely mean 3 not guilties, and 1 guilty would likely mean 3 guilties. Though technically that didn't have to happen, it was certainly what we expected to happen. And in this case, it is indeed what happened.
Now, I just wanted to follow up. You know, you talk about 3 counts, and they're all punishable, like up to 10 years on each count. You know, we know Mr. Cosby is 80 years old, and that certainly kind of amounts to a life sentence in effect.
Yeah, as we discussed just a little while ago, in theory it could be up to 30 years behind bars, but obviously the sentencing guidelines would suggest far less than that. But again, he is 80 years old, not in the best of health, and so even a handful of years behind bars could be tantamount to life in prison. It looks like from the setup we're seeing here with these sheriff's deputies that we are seconds away, perhaps, from seeing Bill Cosby newly found guilty of being a sexual predator emerge from this courthouse. Absolutely mind-boggling when you think about the history of the career of this man, the entertainment that he has been part of, the legendary entertainer that he became, the iconic sitcom that was so much a part of American pop culture. He was quite literally, for a lot of folks, America's dad. You'll recall that in that role, in that sort of unofficial role of America's dad, he was not shy about telling especially young African Americans how to behave, how to comport themselves, treat others with respect, dress appropriately. This was part of the whole Cosby spiel, if you will. And there are those now who say this was a lot of hypocrisy from Bill Cosby. We're told he's leaving the court. Here we go now. This is the defense team. Tom Mesereau, the lead defense attorney. Mr. Mesereau, anything to say? Ms. Bliss? Mr. Cosby coming now. Mr. Cosby right here. Andrew, anything to say? Mr. Cosby, anything to say? Not a word. We will see if they make a statement down by their vehicle, which we have expected would happen. We don't know whether that's going to happen, but that was the expectation, that they would make some sort of a statement. The Cosby defense team is one element. There is also a public relations team made up of Andrew Wyatt and Ebony Benson, and their role has been to sort of play the court of public opinion while the attorneys were doing their thing inside the courtroom. And that public relations team of Benson and Wyatt have spent a lot of time complaining about what they viewed as unfair media coverage throughout this trial and unfair behavior, inappropriate behavior by either the judge or the district attorney, or both. So again, they have gone around the bend now, around the corner of the courthouse, and so I am not positive whether they in fact are going to be making a statement or not.
Yeah, Bruce, I can see where they are. It looks like they have stopped. They were raising, both his spokesman and Bill Cosby were kind of raising their arms, and now they're stopping and surrounded. It looks like they may be getting ready to make some remarks. As you mentioned, they've done it every day of the trial. So they have stopped, and it looks like they will be saying something here. So let's see, they have, although there's no microphone there, although now Tom Mesereau has stepped into the picture. Now we're hearing questions being thrown. I don't know if there's a mic in front of me, we can hear them.
What is your reaction?
Here's Tom Mesereau.
We are very disappointed by the verdict. We don't think Mr. Cosby is guilty of anything, and the fight is not over. Thank you.
Are you going to appeal, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, very strongly.
Is Mr. Cosby prepared to go to prison? Andrew, can we have a word with Mr. Cosby? You prepared to go
Tom
to
Mesereau
prison,
didn't say as he's being thrown questions there. Mr. Cosby, are you being prepared to go to prison? As the defense attorney, Tom Mesereau, mentioned there that they are not happy with the verdict and the fight is not over, as we're seeing Bill Cosby and his spokesperson get into an SUV and get ready to leave. So that's all they said. All you can tell from that is that they were not happy with the verdict, as you could imagine, and that he said that the fight is not over. That's all they said. The spokesperson did say nothing, nor did Mr. Cosby. As we've talked about, guilty on all 3 counts, could face up to 10 years in prison on each of those counts, which are all felonies. So the first time, of course, it resulted in a mistrial a little over a year ago, and a lot has changed in that past year. Of course, the Me Too movement has happened, and it's a different environment now, and a lot of people were wondering how that would affect this retrial, if at all. So there is a podium of microphones we see there, but they didn't stop for very long. They are now in that SUV, and we are getting ready to head out of there. So this has been an interesting day, and maybe a surprising verdict for a lot of times. And Bruce, I don't know, you were there, of course, covering this whole thing, and I don't know what you get the sense of over these past few days. Surprise at this verdict, given the jury was taking a little bit of time and asking some questions?
Well, I got to tell you, Ian, nothing would have surprised me. I think you could have made the case on either side of this trial and made it pretty successfully. The jury obviously has spoken during the time of these deliberations over the past day and a quarter or so, maybe day and a half maximum. You're trying to read the tea leaves. You're trying to get some sense of, okay, what does it mean that the jury wants to hear this again or that again? Yesterday, when they asked to hear Cosby's words again, they wanted to hear the definition, the legal definition of consent. You might say, well, they want to hear the legal definition of consent. That sounds like a question the prosecution would like. Then you've got this morning hearing back the testimony of Margot Jackson, a key defense witness, and you might say, well, gee, that's something that maybe suggests they believe her story and that maybe this is good news for the defense. So you could easily have gone either way on this. I'm not going to pretend that this was a slam dunk one way or the other. Clearly, the jury believes these charges were legitimate. Andrea Constand was an actual victim, not someone who was simply trying to con Bill Cosby, as the defense had claimed.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always tough to tell what a jury could do, and we mentioned one of the maybe most damaging to Mr. Cosby was that they were able to introduce testimony this time, as you know, from 5 other women who told jurors that they believed they had been drugged and sexually assaulted by Mr. Cosby. That, of course, was not the case in the first trial, and that could have played a role in this trial, which was a little bit different this time, also given the fact that we're in the middle of the Me Too movement as well. So 2 different factors that I think probably came into play in this retrial that were not in play in the first trial.
Yeah, Ian, there's no question about that. This was a huge decision by the judge this time based on an unrelated court decision that said, yes, this time around the prosecution may bring 5 additional accusers to the witness stand as part of the story against Bill Cosby, as opposed to the 1 who was allowed last time. The 1 last time, to be perfectly candid, I did not think was perhaps the most effective witness. Her sense of when her incident with Cosby occurred was wildly back and forth in terms of when it happened, literally years apart. Did it happen at this time or at that time? And it made it tough for her story to resonate. The 5 accusers this time around, I think, told pretty effective stories, quite frankly. All of them a similar mode. Bill Cosby befriends them, becomes a mentor, becomes sort of a father figure for them, and over time sees them clearly as a romantic conquest to be had, drugs or gives them alcohol, and then sexually molests them. That was their allegation. And interestingly, and this is kind of I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here on the legal terminology here, what happened is the judge says with these additional 5 accusers, you may come to trial and testify for the sole purpose, really, of trying to make the prosecution point that this is not a mistake. It's called absence of mistake. In other words, Bill Cosby could not have mistakenly believed Andrea Constand was a willing sex partner, and that he didn't know that what he was giving her was going to cause her to be incapacitated. It couldn't have been a mistake. Why? Well, because look, it's happened before. And so these 5 witnesses are there to say, look, there's a pattern of prior bad acts, it's called, and that says to the members of the jury, not really thinking this is a mistake because he's done this kind of thing before. So that testimony, I have to believe, was important for this jury. Again, we obviously haven't spoken to any of the jury members, and we're not sure we'll be able to in the hours and days ahead, but at the moment anyway, one would have to believe that testimony, which was far more numerous and more powerful in my view, was key in this case.
Yeah, I think we.
And here goes the Cosby team heading out. Police, as you can see, trying to keep the crowd under control here on bikes, and they're now trying to create a bit of a wall here so that folks don't get in the way. This is the actual vehicle, I believe, that Cosby is in, and the bike police here doing a good job of keeping things under control. Make sure nobody gets hurt. There are all kinds of Cosby supporters and Cosby detractors out here. And there goes the Cosby team. That's Andrew Wyatt's left fist out the window there. Sort of a show of defiance, if you will. Cosby himself raising his fist as they left the courtroom. If you didn't know better, you might have thought they won this case. They did not.
Exactly. They got out of your view coming around the courthouse when they came out. They were both raising their fists as well, Bruce. And this is certainly a dramatic culmination of an 18-year case that has spanned a couple of criminal trials, and we heard all the emotional stuff from people in Gloria Allred, who said she's never been happier with a decision in her 42 years, and I think it just makes us realize how impactful this has been and how powerful this moment today is for so many people.
Yeah, I think what's important to mention here too, Ian, is that one of the things that's always a challenge in these kinds of cases, and certainly theoretically was a challenge with Andrea Constand, is the fact that A, she did not report the incident immediately right after it happened. B, there was some misstatements, some confusion in her description of exactly what happened. And 3, she stayed in touch with Mr. Cosby after this incident had occurred. And so those who are looking askance at her story will say, sure, she didn't know what happened. She waited to report it. And wait a minute, she's hanging around this this guy after he's done this? We don't believe it. I think the prosecution made a very strategic and very smart move in this second trial. The very first witness they brought to the stand was an expert on this subject who said, look, not only are these three elements, waiting to report, having some missteps in your statement, and staying in touch with your alleged attacker, not only are these three things not unusual, in fact, they are quite common. They are absolutely routine in legitimate cases where there's a real attack here and not someone trying to play the system. So the jury right off the bat was sort of primed and ready. They sort of set the table for the jury to say, look, you're going to hear Andrea Constand. She's going to admit it took her a year to report this. There were some misstatements that she made in terms of exactly what happened. And yes, there were lots of phone calls between Constand and Cosby in the days, weeks, and months that followed this incident. So what do we make of that? Well, the prosecution wanted jurors to know right off the bat that this was not uncommon. In fact, it was quite typical.
That's a great point, and I think a lot of people don't realize.
We'll go back to you. We've got people deciding that this is apparently funny out here. I'm not sure why they think that, but
yeah, I'm not either. But I know you talk about that, Bruce, and there's victim shaming, and you're right. In this kind of situation, a lot of times that is what happens, especially when someone's in a more powerful position. And I thought they did a good job as well of trying to lessen the damage of that $3.4 million payout that she got, as well as what you talked about, and the fact that these things are quite common. To kind of overcome those hurdles, in addition to those 5 other women who testified about the prior bad acts, which can show a pattern. And I think those things were different, obviously, really significantly different than the first time around.
Yeah, you mentioned that $3.4 million lawsuit settlement. That is new. Again, that's different. It's information we didn't have in the first trial, and I think that could be viewed as something pretty significant as well. The defense tried to suggest that that was essentially pocket change for Bill Cosby, a man of his wealth. But the prosecution made the case, I think fairly persuasively, that when you write a check for $3.4 million to settle a lawsuit, that's not just covering legal expenses and saying, look, easier to do it this way than go through a big trial and all the aggravation and the embarrassment of that. That's real money. No matter how wealthy you are, $3.4 million is a lot of money, and that suggests, even though the statement, as these statements always do, admitted no wrongdoing on the part of Bill Cosby, the idea here was that $3.4 million implies, it's a tacit admission, if you will, that something bad happened here, and I, as the person writing that check, I'm sorry about it.
That's a good point as well. And, you mentioned that Mr. Cosby and the spokesman were maybe appeared defiant as they were walking out and driving away in the SUV, but we know that Cosby did lash out at the prosecution when they were talking about revoking his bail. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, really a startling moment. Cosby, throughout this entire trial, has been very low-key, almost stone-faced. In fact, as during breaks in the trial, has actually dozed off in his chair there, right up at the front of the courtroom there. Not usually within sight of the jury, though. But at any rate, so what we've got going on here is a situation. Let me let some of these guys go by here who are deciding that this is a lot of laughs out here. Anyway, well, I'm sorry. I've lost my train of thought, and I apologize.
It's okay. I know it's a crazy scene out there. We just wanted to ask you to talk about the fact that he lashed out at the prosecution when they were talking about revoking his bail, and you were starting to get into that about how he's really not said anything throughout the trial.
Yeah, my apologies, Ian. Yeah,
No
basically. Basically, Mr. Cosby was standing there stone-faced throughout the vast majority of these proceedings, rarely saying anything except when asked. At the point in time when the prosecution asked for his bail to be revoked, saying he was a flight risk, because quite literally a flight risk, because in the eyes of the prosecution, hey, this guy owns a private plane. At that point, Cosby apparently had had enough. Cosby shouted out, and I do mean shouted out, he, meaning himself, doesn't have a plane, you a-hole. Didn't use the word, it didn't use the letter A. He said the whole word, and there was a gasp that went out. The judge, of course, admonished him to remain quiet, and after that he said virtually nothing and made very few facial expressions to suggest that he was happy, sad, or anything else. But the actual outburst was quite remarkable, and something that, given how quiet he had been, was completely out of character. And again, this is all seen through the lens of America's dad. This is the guy who sold us Jell-O pudding for years, and here here he is using an obscenity in the courtroom, lashing out at the prosecution for suggesting he might be a flight risk. Again, as we described earlier, he is essentially under house arrest while this whole sentencing process takes place, and that's weeks in the making as well. That whole sentencing procedure is something that takes a while. They have to go through all kinds of background on him, and then they come to a conclusion about what kind of sentence is going to be appropriate.
And it is a great point, as you write, Bruce. A lot of people saw him through that different lens when he kind of lashed out, and this is now the culmination of a almost 20-year kind of case, and being found guilty of and facing a possible 30 years in prison. Very different for someone who was looked at as America's dad for so many years. Just really a significant and impactful day. As we have one camera, Bruce, we can't see, you can't see it, but we got the camera on the SUV that Bruce Cosby and his spokesperson are in, and they are driving away. As you talked about, almost looking a little bit defiant as they walked out and as they pulled off there from the court. So an interesting day. Just to recap, in case you're just joining us, Bill Cosby been found guilty on 3 counts in this sex assault retrial. Sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to say the District Attorney, Kevin Steele, is going to be holding a news conference at 3 o'clock this afternoon, just across the street from the courthouse here, where he'll be giving his assessment of all of this. Kevin Steele not given to a lot of emotion, but one has to believe he is incredibly proud of his prosecution team and incredibly happy with this result. Again, there was more than a little shaking of heads and clucking when this first trial ended in a mistrial with a hung jury. Back in the summer of 17, this trial ended with, again, there's no official number that we've seen, but there's been a discussion of anywhere from 10-2 for prosecution, for not guilty, or for guilty, I'm sorry, anywhere from 10-2 for guilty to 7-5 for guilty. We never heard an official number from anyone, but again, it took some guts, frankly, for the district attorney to come back and try this case again, knowing that another mistrial, another hung jury, or a not guilty verdict would make him look rather pathetic, to be perfectly candid. This was not cheap to try this case. There's a lot of money involved, a lot of taxpayer dollars, and so this was a lot riding on this case for Kevin Steele, who you'll remember made the prosecution of Bill Cosby a huge, even some would say central part of his campaign against Bruce Castor when he ran for district attorney in the first place. So the idea that this was going to end with anything other than a guilty verdict was going to be quite an embarrassment for Kevin Steele. It has ended exactly the way he wanted it to, in what he clearly views is the right way, the way that justice would suggest. And so we'll hear from him at 3 o'clock. We'll obviously bring that to you as we brought to you the rest of this trial. But this is a big victory for Kevin Steele. Again, Bruce Castor, the district attorney here back in the day, back in 2005, took a look at this basic fact pattern and said, we will not bring this case to trial. Now, it is fairness to Mr. Castor, we should let you know that in between these two times, these two cases, that decision by Castor and these prosecutions, a judge ruling released information about Cosby's deposition in the civil suit, the Andrea Constand civil suit. That Cosby deposition is the one where he infamously described giving quaaludes to women with whom he wanted to have sex back in the 70s and early 80s, back during the so-called disco scene. He talked openly in that deposition, the civil suit, about giving women quaaludes with whom he wanted to have sex. That information was sealed until it was unsealed by a judge back in 2015. That reopened this whole ball of wax and got this prosecution rolling once again. You'll recall that Kevin Steele and his district attorney's office filed these charges December 30th of 2015, just under the wire, if you will, with regard to the statute of limitations. In fact, the defense at this second trial tried to suggest that whatever happened was consensual and that whatever happened in mid-December of 2003, earlier than what Constand had said. And the reason they said that, of course, is that had it happened in December, mid-December of 2003, the 12-year statute of limitations would have expired, and this case would have been basically dead on arrival. So the jury clearly did not believe that this happened in mid-December of 2003, clearly believed the basic time frame that Andrea Constand had laid out, which was that in January of 2004, she goes to Cosby's house. She is tense, she is nervous, she's thinking about leaving Temple University and her position as director of operations for the women's basketball team, and to go back to Canada to do perhaps massage therapy, but get out of this job that she's in and move away. She's tense, she's nervous, they talk. Mr. Cosby says, I've got 3 little friends for you. He claims they were 3 pieces of the cold medication Benadryl, a tablet cut in half, another half, so that's 3 tablets. He says what he gave her was 1.5 Benadryl. Prosecution clearly never believed it was Benadryl, but they had no real hard proof that it was anything stronger, like, for example, Quaaludes. So the best they could work with is, all right, if it's Benadryl, that's what we'll work with. Interestingly, when Andrea Constand reveals all of this incident to her mother about a year later, and the mother gets involved, Gianna Constand, she tries to essentially get Cosby to confess over the phone. She records him on the phone, and she tries to get him to say, what did you give my daughter? She wants him to tell her, what did you give my daughter? That's all I want to know. Cosby is very coy about that. Promises he'll give her information, but never does. And that has to weigh on the jury's mind as well, one would think. If this was just cold medication, a tablet and a half of cold medication, why wouldn't you admit that to Andrea Constand's mother? Why would you be so coy about it? He promised he would get her that information about what, in fact, he had given her daughter, never did. And that's the kind of thing that jury might have also been thinking about as they came up with this guilty verdict.
You know, and Bruce, to kind of go further there, you know, one of the star witnesses of the defense was Marguerite Jackson, of course, in her testimony that, you know, when she was talking with Andrea Constand, that she could make up the allegations against a rich celebrity and get some money. And you'd have to think, again, reading the tea leaves, that the jury just didn't buy that.
Yeah, and look, I didn't, to be very candid, I didn't think the prosecution did a particularly strong job in cross-examining her, cross-examining Marguerite Jackson, but I do think the jury might have, again, and we're reading tea leaves here, we're trying to reach into the minds of the jury here, and I apologize for that, but I do think it's reasonable that the jurors might have looked at her statement and said, this, from what we know of the prior testimony in the case, was someone who was not a particularly close friend of Andrea Constand's. Andrea was described as someone who was quiet, who was shy, did not have a lot of friends within the Temple University athletic program. It wasn't that she was disliked, she just didn't have a lot of friends because she was quiet. Marguerite Jackson had 2 earlier statements from last year and early this year in which she said that she and Andrea Constand had on 6 different occasions roomed together when the women's basketball team was on the road. When she got on the witness stand, 6 suddenly became 2 or 3 times. So there's some question there. How did that number suddenly drop to 2 or 3 times? Clearly they weren't close friends. They roomed together maybe 2 or 3 times. So the incident in question where Marguerite Jackson says, hey, we were watching TV, we heard about a celebrity being sued over sexual misconduct, and Andrea told me, hey, that same thing happened to me. And Marguerite Jackson is alleged to have said, really, that happened to you? Did you report it? No, it was a famous person. I don't think I could fight that. As the conversation then goes forward, Marguerite Jackson said, Marguerite, raised the issue that this was a civil suit, that money was involved, and that is always a big factor in these kind of cases. Well, at that point, she says, Andrea Constand said, no, it didn't really happen to me, but I could say it did to get money. Now, the question you might have as a juror is, if they're not close friends, and they've roomed together only a couple of occasions, would Andrea Constand really confess something as horrific as a sexual assault to this person who was a coworker, but certainly not a close friend? And then, moments later, would she confess to something that was, in essence, a crime, that she was considering engaging in a fraud, that is, making up the allegations to get money? The jury obviously made their decision, which suggests that they did not buy the Marguerite Jackson story, and it's possible they simply didn't believe that Andrea Constand, who, by the way, denied any of this ever happened with Marguerite Jackson, it's entirely possible the jury took a look at that situation and said, we just don't buy it.
Yeah, you know, Bruce, we are waiting on that press conference from DA Kevin Steele that you referenced. And you mentioned that. That's the testimony. Getting back to that, Marguerite Jackson's testimony, that's the testimony the jury had read back to them after 10 hours of deliberations on the first day. And they wanted to hear that testimony back again. I'm sure that was a significant in reaching their verdict. And, you know, we talk about the whole Me Too era and these victims of sexual assault and what happens. And you mentioned sometimes it's difficult for them to come forward. And I think when you look at Tom Mesereau's blistering cross-examination, how they painted Andrea Constand as a liar and vindictive and wanting money, you know, this is why a lot of people say this is why these kind of victims sometimes don't come forward, or it takes them some time to come forward. It is not easy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I have to tell you that the defense the closing arguments by the defense, part of it was handled by the attorney Kathleen Bliss. Probably no coincidence that this part of the close was handled by a woman as opposed to a man, but her assault on the other accusers was, I have to say, blistering. Basically accused all of them of being opportunists, looking for some fame, looking for some money. all the wrong motives, and that essentially these women were making up these stories. Really did a number on their credibility, on their character, on in fact their morals even. The idea that the classic, we hear this term, and pardon the expression, slut shaming or victim shaming, and the idea here was just exactly that what are these women doing going to the home of a married man? No discussion of the fact that Mr. Cosby knew he was a married man, but what are these women doing going to the home of a married man? Why are these women involved with this guy when they know they shouldn't be? What kind of morals do they have? This was the line of attack in the closing argument by Kathleen Bliss, and she was taken to task by any number of observers after the fact. Again, she's doing what she has to do as a defense attorney, which is challenge the credibility, and in this case, apparently the character of the accusers. But there was a fair amount of blowback on that defense close.
Yeah, good point. And that's what the defense is trying to do, of course, is sprinkle reasonable doubt into this case, because it's a very difficult standard to meet, and I think people don't realize that sometimes in the criminal standard. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a preponderance, but it's rather beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not easy to prove, and that was one of the hurdles, I think, in the first trial that they couldn't get in. But I think this time we've talked about it with the jury not believing necessarily Marguerite Jackson's testimony, not giving it a lot of weight, having the 5 other women being able to testify this happened to them before. This is things that all weighed on their mind and I think helped them reach the verdict we do. Now, we don't know exactly what they were doing through there, but we are still waiting now on Kevin Steele, the district attorney there. He's going to have a press conference. It is about 4 minutes after the hour now, and we're going to hear from him in just a few minutes as we keep another camera on the SUV of Bill Cosby and his spokesperson now have made their way some time ago from the courthouse. And again, the jury found Bill Cosby guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. They all carry up to 10 years on each count. And so this is obviously an extremely stunning, for some people, decision. And it's been a almost 20-year process of more than 50 women coming forward, and this sort of ending today in a guilty verdict for what was used to be Bill Cosby, who used to be America's dad. And Bill, Bruce, I just want to ask you one more thing. The fact about this Me Too movement. I mean, again, that's one of the differences that we talked about the first time that this was happening. And since his first trial, we had this Me Too movement with Harvey Weinstein and women being empowered, and just an absolutely tectonic shift in the way we think about what happened. And I think a lot of people were watching this first kind of high-profile trial in this new era to see what would happen given the facts of the case.
Yeah, again, impossible to reach into the minds of the jury before we hear from any of those members, if we do. But it's really fascinating how quickly this Me Too movement exploded. Again, back in the summer of 17, when this first trial played out, none of this had played out. Harvey Weinstein was just a well-known, successful movie mogul. Since then, this entire Me Too movement has exploded and really put an entire different lens on all of the stuff that we're looking at right now. You know, at the risk of trivializing this kind of very important subject in trial, we sometimes tended to view this retrial as sort of the sequel to the first show. Again, Cosby, obviously a longtime television performer. What was interesting was that not only was the audience, if you will, different, that is to say a different jury, first time around brought in from Allegheny County, the Pittsburgh area, this time around locals, folks from Montgomery County, but the script was a little bit different. The prosecution got 2 huge benefits this time around. One, the revelation of that huge dollar figure on the settlement check from Cosby in the civil deposition, in the civil lawsuit, and 2, the 5 additional accusers who were allowed to take the witness stand. Meanwhile, the defense got a gift of its own, and that is the judge allowing this time, when he did not the first time, testimony from Marguerite Jackson. In the end, we know what the jury believed, but this again, while it was a retrial, there were lots of differences, and so no real way to predict what might happen the second time around. But I have to tell you, and along those lines, I have to tell you that while we were waiting for that verdict to be read, and it's done in a question form, by the way, the judge reads the charge and essentially says, how do you find in this charge 1? And the first word of guilty sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Ahead of that time, a minute or so ahead of time, Everyone in the room is, again, trying to look around and see what they see. Do we see any looks on someone's face that suggest they're happy or sad? Of course, no one knows ahead of time. Only the judge when he gets the piece of paper from the jury foreman, a middle-aged woman who stood up very cleanly, very clearly, no sense of nervousness, no sense that the world, if you will, was watching. But afterward, the verdicts are read. Then the jury is polled, and that is to say, each individual juror stands up and is asked, basically, are you in agreement with this verdict? Yes. Sit down. The next one gets up. Are you in agreement with this verdict? Yes. So every one of the 12 had to stand up and affirm that this was, in fact, the verdict that they agreed with. There was no mistake. There was no confusion. This was the verdict. We're waiting, and I'm told that within seconds we're going to hear from District Attorney Kevin Steele, who has put together this prosecution under a lot of pressure and a lot of naysayers who wondered about the taxpayer expense of taking this case back to trial after a mistrial last summer that some folks believed was no better than 7-5 for conviction. Steele decided he would take this case back to court, did so, and has won a huge victory. And you heard earlier some of the other Cosby accusers just lavishing praise on him for the good work that he and his detectives and he and his prosecution team, including Kristen Fedden, who did a wonderful job, and M. Stuart Ryan, also a wonderful job. This was a real team effort. In fact, the prosecution closing argument was handled not by Steele at all, but by Kristen Fedden and by M. Stuart Ryan, both of whom did a solid job. There was some question about the length of it. It went on for about 3 hours, and there were those in the courtroom, I must say myself included, who wondered if you need 3 hours to wrap up your case, then maybe your case isn't as strong as you'd hoped it would be. But whatever they did, clearly they were a lot smarter than we were, and they got the conviction they were looking for and the justice that they believe is appropriate. And you heard those other Cosby accusers just a few minutes ago, again, heaping praise on them for the work they did. This, imagine when you're a Cosby accuser and you've been carrying this around with you for years and years and years, in many cases, many decades, feeling like you will never get the justice you want, living vicariously through this particular case and now seeing this guilty verdict being announced by this jury. Imagine your heart is probably pounding, just about jumping out of your chest. Finally, the justice that you've been hoping for and waiting for all these years is now within your grasp. An incredibly emotional afternoon here, Ian.
Oh, absolutely, Bruce. We saw that, as you mentioned, and it is an incredibly emotional moment for a lot of women who have been carrying this for some time, as you mentioned. So now a lot of people are asking what's next, and we can tell you that while Justice O'Neill did not announce a date for sentencing, Pennsylvania law requires that within 100 days of a conviction, so Cosby could face up to 30 years in prison. Now we're getting set to listen to DA Kevin Steele, who's about to have a news conference and give his thoughts on the case. Let's listen in.
I don't know. Where are they? Let's go, fellas. All right. Thank you all for being here in our grand jury room. Andrea Constand came here to Norristown for justice, and that's what 12 jurors from Montgomery County provided her. And I would be remiss if I did not thank first those 12 jurors for their diligence, the sacrifices that they made, as well as the sacrifices of their families so that they could serve in this important duty that they did. So today we're finally in a place to say that justice was done. As prosecutors, we have a responsibility to seek justice, and we have to go wherever and to whomever it takes us. And to begin, I want to step back to a point that was pretty decisive in this case, and that's when Judge Rebrano released the civil case deposition and indicated in his opinion that the defendant's deposition showed the stark contrast between Bill Cosby, the public moralist, and Bill Cosby, the subject of serious allegations concerning improper and perhaps criminal conduct. At that point, the prosecutors, who are here to do the right thing, and specifically my predecessor, Risa Vetri Furman, opened up and reopen this investigation. So that's a duty, but that duty took courage because she had to open up a case against a powerful man. But I can say definitively that that's one of the things that is done over and over again in the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office. We have shown from our record that money and power, or who you are, will not stop us from a criminal investigation or prosecuting a case. What was revealed through this investigation was a man who had spent decades preying on women that he drugged and sexually assaulted, and a man who had evaded this moment here today for far too long. He used his celebrity, he used his wealth, he used his network of supporters to help him conceal his crimes. And now we really know today who was behind that act, who the real Bill Cosby was, and a jury has spoken with one voice in a court of law and found the defendant guilty of drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant in his Elkins Park home. Now, there's a number of people up here, and I'm going to try to address as many of this as I can. But before you today is just a part of the team that worked tirelessly to get us to this point. And the most important person in this is Andrea Constant. There you are. 14 years later, it may be easy to forget that she was that first courageous person that stood up in public to go to the authorities and say that Bill Cosby drugged and sexually assaulted her. Her courage, her resilience in the face of horrible and unfounded attacks upon her and her family has been so inspiring to all of us. We thank her. We thank her family. We thank her mother, Gianna, for trusting us through this process of prosecuting her attacker. And standing next to her there is Dolores Triani, who with B.B. Kivitz were the ones that were asking the questions in that deposition that Judge Rebrano was referring to that got us to the point where we were able to reopen this case and seek justice. And standing with her through this whole process has been a lot of other courageous women who are willing to stand up and tell their stories about being drugged and sexually assaulted or raped. 19 were willing to stand up with us in this prosecution, take the witness stand, and we are humbled by the courage all of them showed. And we can't help but applaud and celebrate the courage of the 5 witnesses that had a chance to face Bill Cosby in this case, to tell the jury, to tell all of you what he did to them. So Heidi Thomas, Shalon Lasha, Janice Dickerson, Janice Baker Kinney, and Lisa Lott Lublin. We public here thank all of them. I called each of them after the verdict. Was not able to talk to all of them, but they know what they've done, and they know what their courage helped all of us do. So supporting all of these women have been the victim advocates, the victims groups, the women's groups, the anti-rape groups, and so many others. And each of these groups play such an important role in supporting these women and helping them to heal from the ordeal that they have been put through. Those are the people we all owe a debt of gratitude to today for their strength, for their resilience through this entire process, as well as every day, because they stand with us, they work with the victims, and they make a difference in their lives. I'm very grateful to stand here before you with this team, and again, it's not all of our team who worked to see that justice was done, but we had to overcome many legal hurdles that were thrown at us by various defense lawyers who have been on this case for the past 28 months. And this time, from the lawyers of 4 different law firms, and each step of the way, we fought for the opportunity for the victims to be heard, the opportunity to get this case to a jury, an opportunity to be standing before all of you after hearing the defendant had been convicted of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. This team has been incredible. I can't say enough about the prosecutors, the detectives, dedicated staff who, despite everything that was thrown at us, at them, stayed the course, eye on the ball, and worked to get us here today. And I'm so incredibly proud of these talented people. They're committed always to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I'm going to have to start with, I think I heard them referred to recently as thunder and lightning. So Mr. Ryan here on my left, he heads our family protection unit, and you know he's prosecuted a lot of cases, sexual assaults, rapes, and those have been drugged in sexual assault cases. He's been with our office 6 years, and just is one of the best. You saw some of that talent coming across throughout this trial, and I got reports on how I looked as I was watching what they did, and it's the other thing I enjoy doing is coaching, and you know, you get to these points where you work with kids, you work with young adults, and you get to that point where you put them out on the field or onto the court, and there's not much you can do at that point other than watch. And I could not have been more proud of what they did throughout this whole thing, and some of the cross-examination that you all got to see, and some of the quick-witted remarks were something. I think even caused the jurors to laugh when testimony was being read or coming back on things, and where they had the ability here is closing, and Kristen here. So we wouldn't be here if not for her. And I say that because when we came back to look at this case, Risa Vetri Furman, and I should refer to as Judge Furman now, asked Kristen and some of our team to go to Toronto to meet with Andrea. And that was a difficult task. And when Kristen came back, she was adamant about what we should do, and we moved forward. And it was the right thing to do, and she has stuck through this the whole way. And she had an opportunity, which was kind of a bad day for me, when she had a great opportunity for her and her family to go to an excellent law firm, Stradley Ronan, and we talked a lot, and Kristen did not want to leave this and not see it to the end. And we talked to Bill Sasso, the chairman of the firm, who we all owe a debt of gratitude to for allowing her to stay on with us and stay with us through this case. And you have seen the results of that. She, like Mr. Ryan here, has prosecuted so many sexual assaults, domestic violence cases, and she's always stood up for victims and has continued to do this. And I couldn't have found two better partners through this, two better people, two better prosecutors to walk this journey with. Their commitment to doing the right thing has been extraordinary. And I got to talk about this one and the one on the end. Our Deputy District Attorney, Bob Fallon, the captain of our appellate unit, Adrian Jappy. I don't know if you all have noticed throughout the course of this, but we have seen what seemed like hundreds of motions from the beginning when these charges were filed throughout the last days of trial. And these incredible legal minds have found the law that we needed to support our positions, despite those many law firms and many lawyers that have made it difficult for us to get to this point. They've supported our positions to keep it moving forward. They have kept up with everything all of these lawyers have thrown at us and did it with just amazing grace. You've seen them in court. You've seen what they can do, and there's been some pretty memorable writing along the way from each of them, and you all saw a difference maker too when the judge ruled that we could bring prior bad acts in. Adrian handled that argument and just did a stellar job to get us in the position we're in. Our law enforcement community, some of them are up here with me. All the folks from Cheltenham, Sergeant Schaefer, who you saw testify on the stand. But behind that testimony is thousands of hours of work, interviews, analysis, and just plain good police work to put together the case that he did. Our partners in this also have been the leaders of that police department. Now Chief Fry, who has walked this walk with us, and before him, John Norris, the chief who did the work. And when we were looking to open up this case, he was adamant on what we should do and where we should go with it, and he is a great man. Our affiants here, we got the quiet one over there, former Chief Shade, who's Detective Shade with our department, and Detective Reap, who I heard may be your birthday today. Yeah. We're all going to sing happy birthday now? No, just kidding. These detectives worked really hard to reopen this case and throughout the whole process. And I couldn't be more proud of the entire investigative team. They are supported by the lieutenant from our major crimes, Chris Kuklins, Deputy Chief Mark Bernsteele, who has handled so much of these investigative efforts, Chief Gallen, our Chief County Detective, and all the support that they provide and have picked up in this. Beyond the guilty verdict, there have been some other, I think, important outcomes in this case. As we understand, this has been important for sexual assault victims everywhere. but we did this case because a crime was committed against Andrea Constand, and it happened in our jurisdiction, and that was our duty to move forward on. And when you look at this and look at what Andrea has done to stand up and declare what happened to him, she has been a major factor in a movement that has gone in the right direction, finally. And her quiet courage and her actions through this have helped victims to stand up and tell what happened to them. And I think now there's tremendous awareness of how these crimes have been covered up and papered over for the years. And I hope and I pray that our actions have shown that we will stand up with those victims. And all women that are out there standing up and telling their truth, we support them and encourage them to keep it up. And I hope now everybody recognizes that here you're going to be treated with dignity and respect through the process. Another outcome has been an increased look at rape myths or sexual assault myths, and the myth that a victim of sexual assault, especially by someone they knew or trusted, will immediately report it to the authorities, that they will behave in a certain way or they will never talk to anyone again. We've dispelled that here, and that's because that's false, and that's not always the way it goes. Too often these types of crimes, sexual assault, do not get reported, especially in cases where a drug has been used in a drug-facilitated sexual assault, an intoxicant, so the victim does not have a clear memory of what went on. So we hope that this case sends a strong message that the victims of these types of crimes can come forward and be heard on what happened to them. So there was a defendant in this case. The next steps. A sentencing date will be issued by the judge. That is typically within about a 60 to 90 day period of time on when the sentencing date will come. In the interim, he'll be looked at and assessed in a couple ways. There's a pre-sentence investigation that will be done. There'll be a sexually violent predator assessment that will be done. And all of these are standard procedures in these type of cases. These assessments will then be used by the judge in determining the sentence, and that sentencing hearing will have the opportunity to put evidence on, as will the defense. The defendant may be facing years in prison. He was convicted of 3 counts of this, so technically that would be up to 30 years. However, we have to look at merger of those counts to determine what the final maximum will be that he is facing. So in addition to jail time, and I mention this because there's been some things that have been asked about it over time, and typically what is done in a case is that a defendant will be assessed, and all of these things will be looked at in terms of a sentencing. But when a sentencing occurs, there's also an assessment for the cost of prosecution. We expect that we'll be arguing that the costs associated with both the trials, the sequestration, the sheriff's costs for this will go to the defendant. And I will be relying on defense counsel's opening remarks in this when he was talking about $3.38 million being a paltry sum or simply a nuisance. So clearly the costs of prosecution in this matter should not be a problem for the defendant. Dolores, you wanted to say something here, so let me get out of the way.
Good afternoon. I know it's going to be disappointing to you, but I have the privilege of speaking for Andrea, and Andrea will not be speaking today. Only I will. First of all, we have to thank Montgomery County for doing what they have done. Kevin, Kristen, Stewart, and the many, many lawyers in the DA's office who have been diligent in bringing about this just result. I can't even begin to name all the people who have worked on this case. We also, and I'm doing this on behalf of myself and my co-counsel, B.B. Kivitz, who unfortunately moved to Philadelphia and is probably stuck on the Schuylkill as we speak, or she would also be here. But we also want to thank all the police officers who've dedicated themselves to this case, Detective Reap, Sergeant Schaefer, Detective Shade, and the many others who are unnamed, who all contributed to what has happened here today. But most of all, I want to express, on behalf, if I can, the gratitude of so many women who admire Andrea for her courage. She came here 14 years ago for justice. I am so happy today that I can say that although justice was delayed, it was not denied. It took a lot of courage for her to come back and to do this. There are so many people who've expressed their admiration for her. The millions, and I do mean millions of people who have admired her courage, admired her calm, admired her demeanor. And I'd ask you to bear in mind that when something like this happens to someone, male, female, whoever, they have to work every day to be happy. Something that we all who have been fortunate in our lives and not been victimized do not have to do. And when you see Andrea, and you've all commented about how calm she is, how graceful she is, that's something that she's had to work out every day since January of 2004, probably January 6th or 7th, when this happened to her. This is a life-altering experience for any woman, any victim. And the person who I think needs to be heralded for what she has done is Andrea. Thank you.
All right, we'll take questions.
Kevin,
Go ahead.
You were in the moment this verdict was being read. Take us back, please. I know there was an exchange with the defendant immediately after for bail revocation. But in those moments, what was going through your mind, please?
I've been at this for a while, 25 years, and when a verdict comes back, you're always anxious on what the result was going to be. I keep the verdict sheet in front of me, and I checked them off as they were read. It's a solemn moment because it's hard work for a jury, 12 ordinary folks from our community that came in and served, and so I didn't react. I won't under those circumstances, and we heard the verdict, and I'm just grateful for what they did, and that they were willing to stand with us in this and stand up for what happened. I have never seen the type of attacks that were levied on people that were coming forward to describe how they were sexually assaulted, and when that happened, I was concerned. I was really concerned that that we're not moving past the vestiges of what happened before, that people wouldn't get it. But I think they listened to Dr. Ziv. They heard what was real and what was false, and they were strong when they came back. They were polled, meaning that every one of them was asked whether they agreed to the verdict. And all I heard from each of them was strength. And I'm grateful for that, and grateful for what they all did and the commitment that they gave to Montgomery County, our citizens, our communities, and this is bigger. So, yeah, Joe.
During the discussion of bail, an incredible outburst by the defendant. Throughout your opening and closing statements, you've said this is not Dr. Huxtable, this is not America's dad. Is that the man that you were speaking of?
Well, I guess you got to see a brief view of who he was. That's just him acting out. I think everybody got to see who he really is when each of those prior bad act witnesses got to testify. You know, the guy was an actor for a long time, and it was an act. It was an act.
Kevin,
We got to see who he really was. So.
Kevin, standing here before us, you speak with emotion in your voice, especially in talking about Andrea. You speak with tears in your eyes. Describe emotionally what this process has been like for you, especially considering the critics who did not think it was worth retrying this case.
Look, you know, this is about our duty as prosecutors, and it's really not that complicated. It's about doing the right thing. We had to investigate a case. We had to make determinations on what happened, and then move forward. And that's our job, and that's our duty. And we, I hope, did it in as graceful a way as we could, despite what was being thrown at us and being thrown at a number of people. But I'm not going to get into nonsense with him on this. Yeah.
Do you think other prosecutors will look to this case in dealing with allegations of sexual assault against high?
I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but I can tell you it's been an interesting start to becoming district attorney. I have had a couple cases here that have been with powerful people, as most of you know. You know, I tried a case where the chief law enforcement officer in the state had committed crimes, and we had to go in, and that's not the most comfortable place to be when you have to tear apart your profession in some ways, because she was a prosecutor. But I think that's just an example of, you know, we're gonna go where the investigations take us. We are going to look to see who has committed a crime, and you know, whether they're powerful, whether they're wealthy, whether they have evaded the law in the past. We just have to do our jobs, and you know, I hope if there's anything that comes from this is that, you know, you can move forward on these cases, and when you do, you know, I've now had 2 juries, you know, stand up against the powerful and say guilty on every single count that has been alleged against them, and I think that's a recognition of the fact that we're doing the right thing, and the fact that the juries, you know, understand the significance of this.
Kevin,
Yeah,
are
Carl.
you going to continue your attempts to get bail revoked for Mr. Cosby before sentencing occurs?
Well, we're going to
and express what your concerns are about.
Well, you know, I said it in court. I'm concerned when there is somebody with the wealth and the aspects of you know, being a potential risk of flight because of what he's facing. The judge made a determination, and I respect his determination that that could be satisfied by him remaining in Montgomery County for the present, and we'll have to take a look at it.
So it's not necessarily a closed issue for you at this point?
Well, no, I mean, these things never are, right? I mean, we have cases every day where people are out on bail and they commit new crimes, or they try to flee, or they do something along those lines. We just have to be vigilant and make sure that we're keeping an eye on every aspect of this so that we can be prepared if something like that happens. Yes, sir.
Tom Mesereau said that the fight is not over, and a number of legal experts have pointed to the 404B witnesses, the prior bad act witnesses, as being a potential vulnerability on appeal. Can you talk about how you're ready to defend against that, and do you feel confident that that's not going to expose you to problems on appeal?
So I mentioned them before. We have our Deputy District Attorney, Bob Fallon, Captain of our unit, Adrian Jappy. I'll put them up against anybody. And they walked with us through this, and we asked for 19, and we felt that we had the grounds for 19, or otherwise we wouldn't be asking for it. So we're appreciative that 5 women got to voice what occurred to them in the courtroom, but this is a case where there were so many more.
Do you expect to have some more women testify at the sentencing? Would that be the appropriate place for more women, more victims?
Potentially. I mean, that's something, and you know, and I'm not going to say today what we're going to be asking for in terms of sentencing. That's all the assessments that need to be done. So you do the pre-sentence investigation. You look at, you know, what these assessments developed. You speak to victims. You know, they get a voice in this, and they should have a voice in this to make a determination of what the appropriate request is at the time. So that's all the process that we'll be going through in between now and when the sentencing date is.
But it is more appropriate, I mean, for more victims potentially could be.
Potentially can, but it's also an area that is somewhat gray in Pennsylvania to be able to do that. So we've heard testimony in effect from 5 of the women at this point. So, you know, I think that goes into the consideration, and we'll be assessing it, and our appellate unit will tell us what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. Yes, sir.
Has your office been approached by any new Cosby accusers since the trial began?
I can't speak about investigative matters. I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Steele,
yes, sir.
This is a vastly different trial, obviously, than the first one. But speak, if you can, about the importance of having those 5 women allowed to testify, the additional accusers, and also counteracting the defense's con artist claims, Margot Jackson's testimony.
So you all got to hear from someone who I think very highly of, Dr. Barbara Ziv. And the legislature, in their wisdom, has given us the ability to have somebody who is an expert in this area educate a jury. And you saw that as our number 1 witness, our first witness in this case. And I think in the process, she was able to explain the situation. And then when you heard from the different people and you saw what the defense was trying to do, despite those sexual assault myths that lie out there, I think there's a recognition. And again, I hope it's not a tack that's continued, because it didn't work. And it is a situation where it was a different trial. We were able to do that on the front end of the case, and I think that's the benefit of having done this once before. So.
Without the legislature making that change only a few years ago to allow someone like Dr. Ziv, you wouldn't have been able to call her to the stand. How critical was she in your ability to secure a conviction today?
I think that would be a better question for the jurors on how impactful she was, but to us, it was very important, and it's something that we kept going back to and looking at, and Kristen did the direct examination from her, but we went back to that report that she did a lot because it was significant in showing what the real science is behind this and how this goes. And Dr. Valier, who testified in the last trial about this, she's another great expert in this arena, and I think it's important that these messages get out, that's what this is. And maybe at some point we won't need to put on an expert to educate a jury because we'll all recognize that those sexual assault myths are not real. And we should be looking at everything that happens to somebody who has been sexually assaulted.
Any chance that Marguerite Jackson could face perjury charges?
Can't talk about investigations.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the difference between having a local jury pool, a Montgomery County jury, as opposed to an out-of-town jury, and whether you think that had an impact, like maybe the difference? I'm not saying for anybody, but this jury to me seemed very different. It seemed to be really paying close attention. They took a lot of notes. They remind me a lot of the Sandusky jury, actually. They really were paying attention. So, do you think that had an impact having a Montgomery County jury? Do you think that helped? Obviously, it helped you won, but
I appreciate being on my home court. I do. We have a great community here. We have a community that supports law enforcement. We have a community of people that sacrifice so much to think going into this, you're going to be removed from your family, as the defense kept saying, for a month, is a huge sacrifice to make. But their willingness to do this, and as you said, to pay the rapt attention that they did to every step of the way, we're just grateful. And I'm grateful that we live in this community. I'm grateful that we get to choose jurors like that who do the right thing, and that's what happens here, and it happens over and over again. So, yeah, it was great being on our home court.
Mr. Steele, what is your message to prosecutors in other jurisdictions, whether they be New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Chester County, who may view these cases as historically very difficult to prosecute? After today, what's your message to any prosecutor who may be on the fence about pushing forward with a case of this nature?
I'm not here to send messages to my colleagues. We are in a great community of prosecutors, particularly in Pennsylvania, and I get to work with them through the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association, and all I can tell you about that is the incredible outpouring of support that I've gotten every step of the way along this journey. That they've been great, and I look at our colleagues in the Attorney General's office, and how they've walked this walk with us. Michelle Henry, for example, who tried the Kane case with me. Each step of the way, these folks are here to support. So I don't think it's any need or time to send a message to all of them. We're all working these cases together, and each person has to deal with it in their own jurisdictions. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Steele, what is your thought to victims out there? Because as Kristen said in her closing arguments, they were character assassinations that took place in that courtroom. And if someone feels too scared to come forth at this time, just a chilling effect.
I hope the end result will not cause somebody to refrain from coming forward because we got to the right result in this, and yeah, it's difficult, and people were put through character assassinations, and it was very difficult to sit through and watch, but you also saw what the jury did in the end, and I hope that people recognize that you got to show courage like this lady did. Like, she showed courage. She stepped up. She went forward, and we got to the right result. And she stayed through this. You know, she didn't have to start down this journey with us. She didn't have to come here for the first trial. She didn't have to come here for the second trial, but she did. You know, and I think that means so much. And I hope that others that have been victimized understand that and see that courage and see where it can get. Because for all of us, it was just about doing justice. You know, and sometimes you feel like that's just us that is looking for that, and you got a lot of people working against you to that end. But despite each of these legal hurdles, these things that happened across the way, you know, we got here, and we got to all sit in that courtroom and hear the defendant convicted of all of the offenses, you know, found guilty. And I think that's important for victims to know and understand that we're going to stand with them. We're going to walk this journey with them, and do the best that we can and treat them with dignity and respect.